Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the D and WhatIf, with another fanfiction. This is the first part of What If Deku swapped with Shouto. All credits for this video go to their respective authors, so please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. The hospital window was thrown wide open, letting in the chill air. The bleak-looking, heavy curtains waved gently in the breeze. Enji Todoroki considered closing them, but decided against it, sitting down in the hospital chair. His eyebrows knitted together tightly, staring down at the child in Hanako's arms. Hanako Todoroki looked down fondly at her baby, her unfocused eyes calm and wonder-filled. She cradled him against her chest, fingers gently stroking the little sprout of black hair that tufted the baby's fragile skull. The baby wriggled, pink-faced. "Congratulations, your baby boy is very healthy," the nurse asked, looking at the boy's clipboard. "Have you thought of a name?" "Izuku," Hanako answered quickly. Enji frowned, exasperated. "I thought we agreed on Shouto for a boy." Hanako stared at Enji. Her eyes were bright, stunning for the first time in years. "His name is Izuku," she said, forcefully. "Hanako," Enji started, and cut himself off, glaring. Hanako stared back at him, eyes sharp. The nurse pressed the clipboard to her chest, a little awkwardly. "Okay," she said, "I'll get you the paperwork, shall I?" Izuku Todoroki came home with them 3 days later, and was placed into a pre-prepared cot. His siblings fawned over him. Mishio Todoroki, who was only 5 years older than Izuku, spent a lot of time curled up under his cot, endlessly fascinated by the little boy. He was usually the one to wake up Hanako when the baby started crying. Fayumi also doted on Izuku, carrying him around the house in a baby carrier, sitting with him to watch children's television and read him bedtime stories, usually surrounded by his other siblings. She changed his nappas and tried to teach him colors and words. Izuku was calm and bright, and totally unlike his siblings. Izuku had a crown of tufty black hair that caught the light green and blue like crow's wings. He started walking 2 months before the other children started talking earlier. He spent much of his time glued to the television, watching the Hero Network, or trailing after his siblings, begging to see their quirks up close. Hanako treated Izuku oddly, holding him away from herself, never really embracing him. She looked at him with eyes glazed over, a faint smile on her face. Other times the sight of him made her sob. On those days Izuku's brothers kept him away from her, entertaining him with showers of tiny snowflakes, or soft, small flames. Occasionally the Hero Network would get too stressful for a 3-year-old. The hero was taking too long to arrive, too many people were in danger, or there was simply too much noise and color, and Izuku would start to cry. It was an awful, hiccuping sob that tugged on Fayumi's heartstrings. When this happened, she grabbed her baby brother by his middle and pulled him onto her lap. For a moment he would be too surprised to keep crying, and she would lean around him, showing him her palm. Gently, she would summon a dusty snow pile. Izuku loved this. He would push his fingers through fine ice, crunching them with his little hands. Occasionally he would put it in his mouth, experimentally, and wince at the brain freeze. It wasn't long until he was trailing after her, tugging on her skirt, asking impatiently for snow. Once, Fayumi brought home some samples from her science class, and Mishio Todoroki, now 8, made his flames burn yellow, red, purple, and green with zinc, strontium, potassium, and copper. This totally enchanted Izuku, and he watched with dark eyes bulging. "Will I have a quirk like that?" Izuku pestered Mishio afterwards. "Could I do that?" Maybe, Mishio said, puffing his chest out from the attention. "Who knows? You might be as good as me someday. Or you could get my quirk," Fayumi said, waving ice-covered fingers at him. Izuku beamed at them, grinning until his eyes started watering. "So you're saying, what?" Enji Todoroki stared at the X-ray. "That he doesn't have a quirk at all?" "Nothing. The lack of an extra toe joint. The fact it hasn't emerged yet." The doctor glanced at the small, dark-haired boy nestled on his mother's lap. "It's highly unlikely it will ever emerge. Your son is quirkless." The mother had an arm tightly around the child, who was staring at the floor. The mother hadn't said anything the entire appointment, instead stared dully ahead, ignoring her child's complaint about her holding him too tightly. "It's very rare," the doctor said, "especially with 2 parents with such strong quirks. In all theory, it should be impossible." Enji stared at the doctor. He glanced at his wife, a doubt worming into his mind. He gripped the sides of his chair tightly. "Thank you for your time," Enji said, standing stiffly. The doctor nodded non-committally. Enji ushered his wife and son into his car and drove home. Izuku couldn't look at him. His father's expression was twisted and angry, a cold fury burning just under the surface. His eyes were dark. When they were home, Enji took his wife by her elbow and dragged her into the kitchen. She slipped on the white tiles and fell against the oven, thumping her head. The small smile that she had worn in the doctor's office was wavering and tears gleamed in her eyes. "Hey, are you okay?" Izuku tugged at his mother's arm. "Can you get up?" Izuku, Hanako pulled her song onto her lap, gripping him tightly. Izuku, my baby boy, Izuku. Enji stared down at them. His usually stern features had an edge to them, just under the surface. Is he mine? He asked, cold. Hanako gripped Izuku tighter. That's too tight, Ma. Izuku tugged at her arms. He glanced up at his father, frowning. Is he? Enji bellowed. Hanako started to shake. She pushed Izuku's head into the crook of her neck, holding him there. He's not, she mumbled. He's not ours. Enji's glare heated up. He's not ours, she repeated, running her fingers through Izuku's hair. He tried to pull out of her grip but couldn't move. He's not mine, he's not yours, he's nobody's. Nobody's boy. What the hell are you talking about? Enji gritted his teeth. Your niece, the pretty one, long hair, psychic powers. Hanako stopped stroking Izuku's hair and instead gripped his head tightly, fingers digging into his scalp. I told her it was hero business, confidential. 10-minute mind wipe for the whole hospital floor. What are you saying? Enji crouched, eyes wide. Whose is he? Hanako avoided his gaze, shoulders shaking. Tears rolled down her cheeks. Nobody's. He's nobody. He's somebody's. Hanako. Enji howled, trying to pry Izuku from her. What the fuck have you done? In an instant, ice spread over Izuku's head. He shrieked, batting Hanako's arms wildly. Enji caught his arm and dragged him from his mother's grasp, holding him easily by his elbow, feet dangling. You're a witch, Enji snarled, a monster. Hanako gripped her knees and sobbed. Izuku returned to the Todoroki house. 3 days later, led by the hand by Enji Todoroki, they exited the car quickly, but Enji held his hand too tightly, standing in the driveway. The Todoroki house was classical and smart-looking, a large, flat building with real wood beams. It looked old. Izuku knew from experience that it got too cold in the winter, and the wooden floors were too slippery to run around in wearing socks. Part of him wanted to break away from Enji and run back inside. But he knew Hanako's absence would be felt too keenly, and his own bandaged skull would be too noticeable. You must not tell anyone anything Hanako said to you, Enji said, voice firm. I know, Izuku said. She is mistaken. Her mental health has been deteriorating for years, Enji said. It is not true, but you must not speak of it outside the family. Yeah, I know, Izuku said, impatiently. Enji gave him a sharp shake. Never, Enji said. Take this seriously. Izuku, never mention this to anyone. Understand? I understand, Izuku said. Enji held his hand tightly for a long moment, and released him. The boy was running over the gravel in an instant, disappearing inside the house. Mishio, Izuku exclaimed. He was 8 now, and had become too tall too fast. His shoulders were thin and his arms were long and lanky. Mishio rubbed a towel over his head. What is it? It had been a long, hot afternoon and he'd showered after he came home from school. His favorite younger brother had spent the day in the park with Fayumi, and ended up a little dusty and muddy but less hyperactive than he had been. Izuku stared at his brother's stomach. You look like a hero. Mishio laughed and ruffled Izuku's hair. I don't, he said. I hardly work out at all. But you look so good, Izuku said. You flatterer, Mishio said. That'll get you far in life, little guy. Just lay it on real thick. With those genuine-looking eyes of yours, you'll get anyone to roll over. Any girl will be yours, just like, he snapped his fingers, that. Don't be so gross, Arata Todoroki grumbled, making a rare appearance in the living room. His hair was the whitest of Izuku's elder siblings, and he'd slicked it back. Unfortunately, that made him look, at a distance, like an old man. He glanced up from his phone, wrinkling his nose. He's too young for that kind of stuff. Also, don't walk around the house naked, it's inappropriate. I'm not naked. Mishio gestured wildly to the towel around his waist. Arata rolled his eyes. It's not too hard to look fit, Fayumi said, addressing a confused Izuku. Mishio's routine is a bit lacking, if I'm honest. That's a bit rich coming from you. Mishio said, you never exercise. She's fine. Boys like him that way. Arata shrugged, a bit of meat on their bones. Now who's being inappropriate? Mishio yelped, but Arata just blinked at him lazily, tapping at his phone. I could look like a hero, Izuku mumbled, gripping his chin. Yeah, Fayumi said, you're actually in luck. This house has a huge gym. It's not used by anyone but Dad, since, you know. Izuku nodded brightly. Fayumi took Izuku's hand, lead him down the hall, and unlatched the gym. Izuku had gotten some light preliminary training there before it became evident no quirk was coming. But that had been years ago. The gym was huge. A long line of dusty mats covered the floor, bordered by several different pieces of equipment, a cross-trainer, a rowing machine, a set of weights, a treadmill. All of them were only a few years old. Izuku stopped by a box of gym clothes and started to pull on as many sweatbands as he could fit on his little arms. To be honest, Dad doesn't use it much anymore either, Fayumi said. Enji Todoroki had not made an appearance in a week. It wasn't rare for them not to see him for months at a time. Fayumi had become the de facto parent, cooking meals and driving her siblings to and from school, attending parents' evening. Luckily, Enji had left them his account details, so she didn't have to support them on her measly salary as a teaching assistant. If she was feeling negative, she might compare her and her siblings to a failed experiment. Izuku padded over to a treadmill. You need to be careful with this stuff, Fayumi said. If you do too much work too soon, you can seriously injure yourself. Izuku nodded. Actually, Fayumi narrowed her eyes, thinking, wait here, don't do anything. Izuku sat down on the treadmill and waited patiently as Fayumi left and came back with a thin book and a DVD box. I got this for Christmas from a friend. Fayumi quirked an eyebrow and crouched next to him. Well, friend is a little strong. Izuku peered at the cover. Emblazoned on the front in bold font was the words 0 to hero. Get a hero body in 3 weeks. Behind the title was a collection of photos of various people running, vaulting, and cycling. 3 weeks, Izuku gasped. Yeah, Fayumi said. If you're determined, then getting fit doesn't actually take that long. The longest boot camp I've seen is only 12 weeks. And that's for those going straight into the army. Losing weight is a lot harder. Izuku stared in awe at the DVD. He flicked through the accompanying book. Just by doing these exercises, he asked. He gave each diagram an in-depth examination. Fayumi shrugged. I guess so, she said. Izuku beamed at her. Fayumi sat in on Izuku's gym sessions, marking her students' classwork and writing lesson plans while keeping a close eye on her little brother. She knew Izuku had the Todoroki failings of overworking himself to the point of damage. She had expected Izuku to work hard at exercise for the first few weeks before dropping it, but he had taken to it like a fish to water. He grew faster, stronger, and more nimble with every day, and seemed to relish in pushing himself hard. Although he exercised alone, he grew competitive, writing his highest scores on a disused whiteboard that hung above the equipment. Izuku tore through every exercise course Fayumi brought home, from rowing training to running, even a few books about meditative exercise. He began writing his own courses, making up little games and challenges for improvement. Izuku had a tendency to hyper-focus on a specific activity, but Fayumi was glad it was a positive one. Fayumi had worried that his excessive exercise was ruining his muscles, so she had gifted him a book on yoga that he added to his growing routine. It wasn't unusual to see him doing some light yoga when she came to pick him up from school. He joined nearly every one of the school's sports teams, as his capacity for exercise increased. There was talk of some kind of scholarship. Although Fayumi knew Izuku wasn't destined for a sports academy, a few years ago, she had been constantly trying to gently dissuade him of joining a hero university, but she now knew it was hopeless trying to convince him. Izuku returned from football practice one day, muddy boots slung over his shoulder. He was nearly bouncing in the car seat, talking about the game and the tactical pros and cons of various positions being filled by various students. He recounted, in great detail, the conversations he'd had with the coach about becoming a goalie. By the time they had returned home, Fayumi noticed a dip in Izuku's mood. What's wrong? She asked, as he helped her sort through the washing, separating light and dark. Izuku sat back on his heels, looking at the dirty sock clasped in his hands. He said, and sighed. I think there's more to exercise than just sports. I want something more competitive, if that makes sense. Something new. Fayumi knew this was coming. By now, she was resigned to the reality Izuku's dreams. It didn't matter if he succeeded as a hero or not. He was destined to try as hard as he possibly could, against impossible odds. Fayumi excused herself, padding to the kitchen. She pulled out a brown envelope from the spice cupboard and went back to the laundry room. What's that? Izuku asked, dropping the socks. I was going to wait until your birthday, she said, but I think you'd probably like to start sooner rather than later. She passed him the envelope. Izuku opened it, and his eyes went wide. A flush bloomed across his cheeks. This is, Izuku said, and cut himself off with a gasp. Yeah, Fayumi said. A dojo membership. Izuku got on well with martial arts, attacking at it with even more vigor than he had exercise, if that was possible. For the first few months he kept up with his sports teams, but gradually he replaced the time slots with various martial arts classes. He did boxing for 2 years, along with taekwondo, taking the maximum number of lessons in both. The bruises and scrapes Izuku collected needed careful explaining to the school's teachers, but it wasn't hard for them to accept the lessons when they saw how much Izuku glowed when he talked about them. His passion for martial arts nearly eclipsed his one for heroes, although the two interests seemed to intersect. He started plastering the Todoroki house with posters and promotional images of martial arts-based heroes. Although there were no heroes that were quirkless, there were a fair amount that got by mostly on physical strength, using their quirks more as tools than weapons. Izuku would talk at length about them, and although Fayumi tried to follow his explanations, she often got lost. As Izuku attended more and more lessons, the amount of money Fayumi started spending on them increased too. She started buying less expensive foods, less clothes, stopped indulging Mishio in so many movie tickets, and eventually started teaching extra classes and tutoring at her school. It was worth it to see Izuku's big, scruffy smile in the aftermath of every match he won. His intense, burning belief in himself was infectious, and Fayumi was glad just to be able to bask in its glow. Mishio poked the stew experimentally. This is, he squinted, breakfast? Fayumi straightened. She finished folding a clean shirt and took the wooden spoon off him. Don't poke it, she said, hotly. It's Izuku's. Why are you feeding him mulch? Mishio frowned. Also, why are you feeding him anything? Cooking's my job. Well, you aren't very good at it, she said, glaring. Mishio wrinkled his nose. That's mean, Fayumi. Fayumi returned to sorting clean washing. I know it doesn't look very appetizing, she said, quietly. Mishio nodded. Cooking's hard, he said, and pulled out a frying pan. Why don't I make us some eggs? Fayumi nodded, frown easing. Why were you making it anyway? He asked, dropping a jot of butter into the pan. It looks like some sort of health mush. It is, Fayumi said. Izuku has a judo match later. Another one. Mishio's eyebrows shot up. Didn't he have a taekwondo one just last week? He did. Fayumi started pairing socks. But I couldn't make it to that one. It was parents' evening. It's looking like I can't make it to this one either. One of my colleagues is ill and I have to sub for him. I might make it, but I'll still be really late. I wanted to do something to show that I still cared about him. Izuku knows you care, Fayumi, Mishio said, gently. I know, but Fayumi sighed. Dad never made it to my spelling bees or my award shows. I don't want that to start happening to him. Mishio cracked an egg into the frying pan. I'll go, he said, watching the white of the egg bubble. You've got lessons. Fayumi narrowed her eyes. It's one statistics lesson, he shrugged. I can catch up later. Fayumi frowned, but was silent for a long moment. Thanks, she said, finally. Mishio grinned at her. The glass kitchen door opened, and Izuku stepped inside, eyes bleary. He was barefoot, pajama shirt tucked into his bottoms. What's that smell? He asked, rubbing his eyes. Breakfast, Mishio said, flipping the egg dramatically. I'm here, Fayumi said, bursting into the dojo. She spotted Izuku and Mishio near the edge of the mats and jogged over. She doubled over, gripping her knees, waiting for her heart rate to drop down to manageable. Sorry I'm late. The children just wouldn't leave. It's okay, sis, Mishio grinned. Fayumi smiled at him and turned on Izuku. So, did you win? She asked. Izuku wilted. No, he muttered. Fayumi stared. No, but you worked so hard for it. Izuku nodded, ears bright. She doesn't mean it like that. Mishio went to ruffle Izuku's hair but then noticed how damp it was and settled for a friendly shoulder pat. Some days you win, sometimes you don't. What went wrong? Fayumi asked. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about that, the dojo master said, appearing behind Fayumi. She was twice Fayumi's age, but didn't look it. She had a taut, lean body and burning orange hair that was pulled into a bun on the back of her skull, leaving room for her twitching fox ears. Izuku didn't lose the fight, he was disqualified. A chill went through Fayumi's stomach. It wasn't because, no, the dojo master waved her hand, ears swiveling like satellite dishes. I actually think the opposite in that aspect. Izuku's lack of quirk means he cannot rely on anything but himself in the match. Too many animal feature quirk users like myself waste time trying to use our ears or extra senses in the match when we should be focusing on our body. So what was it? Fayumi asked. Izuku used an unregulated move, the dojo master said. I believe it was from capoeira. Yeah, Izuku said, shifting uncomfortably. I didn't really think about it, I just moved it. The dojo master nodded. In this case, I think trying to restrict him to one discipline alone is counterproductive. In a real fight, it doesn't matter whether you use strictly judo or not. She pulled out a card from her bag. My partner has mixed martial arts class every Friday and Wednesday. Perhaps you should attend that one instead. Izuku took the card, his eyes bright. Then his eyebrows knitted together and he looked up at Fayumi, sheepishly, like there was a question he wanted to ask but was too embarrassed. Fayumi sighed and smiled. She ruffled Izuku's hair and regretted it when it came away wet. Yeah, she said, you can do both if you want to. Arata. Izuku burst into the kitchen. Spar with me. Arata's head snapped up. A few papers stuck to his forehead. He blinked, blearily. I wasn't asleep, he said, peeling the papers off. Sure you weren't, Mishio said, stirring the curry. The whole kitchen was filled with it, a rich, thick, fulfilling smell that made Izuku's stomach rumble just smelling it. Izuku bobbed up and down, impatiently. I've been in the country. What? 3 hours? Arata rubbed his forehead. You already want to beat my ass. Come on. You're the only one who has fighting experience, Izuku said. You're in the police. Don't you have a whole squad of people from your dojos that want to fight you? Arata grumbled. I don't. Izuku yelped. He does, Mishio said, dropping some herbs into the curry. I had to chase a bunch of them away just yesterday. Izuku flushed. It doesn't matter, he said. Arata, I want you to use your quirk against me. Silence. Arata stared at him, eyes wide. Mishio started, but didn't know what to say. He turned his attention to the curry, heart low in his chest. You know what you're asking, Izuku? Arata asked. He pinched the bridge of his nose. I know, Izuku said. It's not a game, Izuku. Arata frowned. You could get really hurt. I already get hurt, Izuku replied, meekly, when I fight. Not like you would if your playmates used their quirks. Arata snapped. You have no idea. They'd totally crush you. Izuku stared. Gradually, tears formed in the corners of his eyes. You think, he mumbled, voice thick, cause I don't have quirk. Now you've fucking done it, Mishio muttered darkly. Izuku, Arata's eyebrows furrowed. That's not. I'm not just playing, Izuku said, rubbing at his eyes. I'm not weak. I'm not saying it to be mean. Arata glared. It's a fact. You aren't on my level. Arata. Mishio snatched his older brother by the front of his shirt. What the fuck is wrong with you? Hey, Arata tried prying Mishio's smoking fingers from his shirt. Let go of me. I'm only saying it to protect him. You're the one who's letting him run around with dumb ideas in his head. The door thumped open and Mishio looked up in time to see Izuku's hair disappearing around the corner. A thunder of muffled footfalls shook the hallway as the boy ran. You're a fucking jackass, you know. Mishio snarled and released him, skidding into the hallway. Izuku, he shouted as he ran. There was a clunk of Izuku's door being drawn shut. The boy's shadow vanished from the thick paper walls. Mishio heard shaking breathing from the other side of the door, and the fumble of a bolt being drawn. Izzy, Mishio said, pressing a hand to the paper wall. The sound stopped on the other side of the door. Mishio could see Izuku in his mind's eye, legs drawn up to his chest, damp eyes pushed into the gulf between his knees. The boy in Mishio's mind's eye looked wretched. Nobody thinks that about you, Mishio said, peeling his socks off. What's going to happen if that girl from Judo uses her water manipulation quirk against you? You don't look like a pawn to me. You could take anybody, quirk schmirk. Mishio cupped a hand around his ear, straining to hear anything. Nothing. He folded his legs. Arata's an asshole. Mishio shuffled closer to the door, leaning his head against the door. He doesn't mean to be. He loves you. He's just a born-bred asshole. Can't help but be assholish. Soft laughter barely reached his ear from the other side. I don't think you're weak, Mishio muttered. Actually, you kind of inspired me. You know, I have a bargain to offer. You do, Izuku whispered from behind the door. His voice was croaking and sharp. Yeah, Mishio said. It's embarrassing, actually. I saw you at that judo competition and wanted to be like that, able to defend myself, totally ripped like you are. So I took up some judo. Izuku breathed in sharply. You did. Mishio nodded, but then realized Izuku couldn't see him. I did, he said, and in return from a few lessons, I'll spar with you, using my quirk. The door opened with a thunk. Izuku knelt in the doorway, face pink and soggy, eyes raw. A brilliant, blinding look of wonder filled his eyes, bright to the point of painful to look at. He grinned. You mean it? Izuku asked. Mishio pulled him into a hug. Of course, kiddo. The first time Mishio and Izuku spar is 3 weeks later. Izuku managed to restrain himself in order to teach Mishio some more moves, but Mishio could see it was nearly painful for him. For full 3 hours before the fight, Izuku had been nearly buzzing with excitement and anticipation. They stood opposite each other on the mat. Ready? Izuku asked, dropping into a ready stance. The tight skin of his arms and legs had been splotched with freckles from training in the sun. The boy's body was taut and wiry, beaten hard like a wolf. Mishio suddenly felt weak and soft. Ready, he said. Izuku dived for him. Mishio barely fended off the 2 sharp jabs that came for his jaw, but missed the crushing hit that connected with his stomach, knocking him clean off his feet. Nearly faster than he could see, Izuku caught his wrist and twisted him so he landed belly down, the thin boy holding both wrists together, directed away from himself. Mishio coughed into the mat. Izuku blinked quickly, as if he was suddenly realizing what he was doing. You didn't use your quirk. He huffed. I didn't get a chance to, Mishio mumbled, dejected. He wrinkled his nose at the sweaty smell of the mat. Could you get off me? Izuku jumped up, sheepish. The first time Mishio managed to catch Izuku with his quirk was 5 weeks after that, with a kick. Fire spread up from his ankle to his knee, and he drove his shin into Izuku's chest. Izuku's first instinct was to snatch the shin and redirect it, but his mind reacted wildly against that, swinging his arms up and pinwheeling. Izuku landed with a slap on the mat, chest smoking. He hissed, "Oh God, Izuku." Mishio's flames vanished and he dived for his little brother. Are you okay? Damn, I didn't think I'd actually catch you. Do you need something? Are you all right? Izuku caught his brother's shirt, eyes wild. Could we do that again? He asked. I think I know what to do now. He rubbed his chin. It's a mixture of having to move the shin without having to touch it. The first instinct is to redirect it, but that comes with high risk, low reward, even though it ultimately gives you control over an inexperienced fighter. The main goal is to avoid self-injury, so dodging is an obvious solution, but what if the flame user doesn't allow you to dodge, or you never get in range enough to attack back? That would pretty much give the quirk user control over the environment, however, is that just a fitting case where Jag have some kind of distributive case their Izuku's mutterings dropped below audible, a long string of half-whispers. Mishio frowned, a little unnerved. The burn on Izuku's chest was little more than a sunburn, and seemed to have lit a fire in the boy not unlike Mishio's own. Izuku woke up with a jolt, cracking his head on the metal bar in front of him. The train was cold and oddly silent. Yellow light burned into his eyes. Outside, the city was dark in the evening, a deep purple blue, studded with yellow, square windows. Izuku stumbled to his feet, body heavy. What's happened? An old woman asked to Izuku's right, pulling her little dog closer on her lap. Why have we stopped? Something's happened, a 9-year-old boy said, dark eyes wide. A dull screech of metal came from the carriage ahead of them, like the train was peeling itself apart. The floor shuddered. The 9-year-old gripped his knees tightly. Izuku took a step towards the front of the carriage. He was fully awake now, eyes sharp. Don't, the old woman said, standing up, that's where it's coming from. You'll get hurt. Izuku ignored her, keeping to the edges of the carriage where he couldn't be seen through the plastic window between carriages. He saw something black and smooth flicker behind the windows, a long line of white teeth buried in scaled black skin. Stop right now, kiddo, the old woman shouted, or you'll regret it. I'm not fucking around. Izuku clasped the door handle. Metal chilled his hand. He glanced back at the old woman. What? He blinked. The old woman snatched the 9-year-old, holding him by the hair. Step away from that door or the boy gets it, she spat. Izuku let go of the handle, eyes wide. What are you doing? He asked, incredulous. You know what I'm doing, brat. The old woman's wrinkled face twisted to a grimace. Why'd you have to be a hero? Couldn't you've just stayed asleep? Let him go, Izuku said. I don't think so. The old woman brought a switchblade out of her heavy jacket. She pressed it to the little boy's neck. He whimpered. Sit your ass down. Izuku met the boy's big, wet eyes. Reluctantly, he retraced his steps and sat down at the edge of his seat. That's good, the old woman said, holding up her switchblade. She let go of the boy's hair, and he scrambled back to his seat. Izuku leaped at her. His legs wrapped around her middle and they crashed into the train floor, sending the blade scattering away. The boy screamed. Izuku wrapped his hand around both of her wrists, pinning her, and held the other hand up, curling it into a fist. What the fuck? Get off me, you scumbag. The old woman tried to pry her hands from him, but couldn't move them. You're a fucking hero. Kid, what's your quirk? Izuku asked, addressing the little boy. The 9-year-old squirmed, overwhelmed. I can make gusts of wind, the boy said, after a long pause. Good, Izuku said. Don't act like I'm not here, you fucking child. The old woman's bone-thin wrists pressed into Izuku's fingers as she struggled. Izuku ignored her. Izuku pulled the karate medal he'd won earlier the evening and undid the knot. It was hard to do with just one hand and his teeth. But eventually the heavy medallion dropped onto the carriage floor and he was left with the ribbon. He tied the old woman's hands together and tucked the medallion into his back pocket. Izuku stood up, stepping away from the old woman, who was writhing against her bindings. The 9-year-old couldn't take his eyes off her, tears starting to form in his eyes. Hey, Izuku tugged on the boy's shoulder. I'm Izuku. What's your name? HH, the boy started and swallowed thickly. His voice was near inaudible. Hideo. You've been very brave, Hideo. Izuku kept a hand on Hideo's shoulders, keeping him from looking back at the old woman. I need you to do one more thing for me. It's only little. Hideo fiddled with his hands for a moment, avoiding Izuku's eyes. Okay, Hideo said, finally. Izuku smiled. In a moment, I'm going to open the front carriage door. I'm going to need you to give me a big gust of wind. The biggest you can. Could you do that for me, Hideo? Hideo looked up at him. He nodded, slowly. Thank you, Izuku said, and opened the carriage door. For a moment, he saw Hell, a huge beast, indescribable, with thick black skin that sagged around a gaping jaw. Its eyes were bulging and blind, staring in opposite directions. A long tail branched like vines across the floor, threading through the cracks. Long bloodied teeth bared down on a passenger's throat, as sharp as smashed glass. Then a gust of wind nearly pulled Izuku off his feet, and the image vanished. The monster was whipped away like black smoke, revealing a surprised gunman. The passenger stared at him, equally surprised. Izuku's leg came down on the gunman's arm, knocking the gun straight out of his hands. It dropped through the grating, lost. The gunman recovered moments later, making a wild swing for Izuku. He ducked under it, sweeping the gunman off his feet. The man fell, and Izuku jumped on him, pinning his arms behind his back. Do you have something to tie his hands with? Izuku asked the attacked passenger, who looked weirdly familiar. Had he seen her somewhere before? Like ribbon or string or something? The passenger just stared at him. Just a moment ago, she said, voice hollow. It was so real. How did you? It was just an idea, Izuku said. I couldn't see why they'd deliberately bring attention to themselves by stopping the train, and his accomplice didn't want me opening the door. I figured it was because they couldn't have any breeze ruining the illusion. The look the passenger gave Izuku was one someone might give an alien. That's incredible, she said. You figured it out so quickly. It was just a guess, Izuku said, ears bright red. It didn't mean anything. The passenger kept staring. Oh, actually, Izuku knelt on the man's arms and pulled his necktie from around his neck, tying the man's wrists. The tie fabric was hard to bend into a knot, and far too slippery for Izuku's liking, but it would have to do. Do you know why these people are after you? Izuku asked. The passenger brushed a lock of black hair behind her ear. Izuku noticed her cheeks were perfectly made up. It looked professionally done. Her neat eyebrows pulled together. Confused, I'm Emiko Hamada, she said. I'm the head of Hero Relations. Izuku's eyebrows shot up, finally twigging it. I've seen you on television. Hamada inclined her head in a nod. I think just about everyone's seen me, she said. There was a thunk as the train door hit the wall. Not after today. The old woman stood in the doorway. She had cut the ribbons around her wrist with the switchblade, evident from the sloppy cuts left on her wrists. Nobody's ever fucking seeing you again. Izuku leant towards Hamada. What's your quirk? He whispered, quickly. It's electricity-based, Hamada whispered back, but they must have set off an EMP earlier. There's no electricity in a 3-mile radius that I can feel. This is it, pretty lady. The old woman dropped the bloodied switchblade. Nobody knows her here. I sent some decoys to rob a shop a few blocks away to make a scene. That's why he used an illusion, Izuku mumbled. That way, even if there were witnesses, they wouldn't know who had done it. You're on the money, kid. The old woman's hands curled into fists. Too bad there still won't be any witness. As she spoke, the old woman's shoulders bulged and grew. Her inoffensive cardigan popped buttons and her skin grew taut and bone white. A deep purple smoke billowed from her bulging muscles, smelling thickly of rot. Sharp teeth poked through her wrinkled lips, and her eyes were reduced to black beads. Izuku pulled bandages from his back pocket and started binding his knuckles. You've gotta go, he said, looking Hamada in the eye. You're the one she's after. Are you nuts? Hamada said. I used to be a pro hero. I can't leave some kid to save myself. You should be the one leaving. So you don't recognize me either, huh? Izuku shifted into a fighting stance. I'm Izuku Todoroki, 2-year national lightweight boxing champion, and I just got my orange belt in karate. Only orange? Hamada asked, as what used to be an old woman howled into the train ceiling. I only just started. Izuku grumbled, flushing. All right. Hamada shrugged off her jacket. Let's beat this bitch together. Izuku yelped. Sorry, Hamada said, pushing knuckle dusters onto her fingers. Forgot you were a kid. Let's beat this mean lady together, huh? Aforementioned mean lady swung her huge head towards them, acidified saliva burning into her stretched blouse. Her thin, sharp crocodile teeth slid over each other as she bared her jaws. Yeah, Izuku said, gritting his teeth. Let's. 3 hours later, on the other side of town, Fayumi jerked her head up as she heard a car rumbled into the driveway. It was approaching midnight, and Izuku was hours late. Sleeping at the kitchen table had put a decided crick in Fayumi's neck. She jumped up, grabbing her jacket from the back of the chair and stumbled into the garden, straining to see in the dark. The limo parked neatly in their driveway. The first thought was that it was her father, a thought that sunk her heart low in her chest. Then Izuku jumped out of the back. Fayumi, I got the belt. That's great, Izuku, she said, eyeing the limo. Did you get a movie deal too? What? Izuku asked, and looked back at the limo. Oh, this is Hamada's. Hamada. Fayumi frowned. Emiko Hamada stepped out of the limo, running a hand through her perfect hair. Oh my god, Fayumi nearly fainted. Hamada, you meant? Yeah, Emiko Hamada, Izuku said. Your belt is the first thing you tell her about. Hamada frowned. Izuku shrugged. You're prettier in real life, Fayumi said, running a hand across her forehead. Izuku has an incredible quirk, Hamada said. Analysis like the kind he has is hard to find. Izuku frowned. I don't have an analysis quirk. Hamada blinked, taken aback. Strength then, she said. It's unusual to see such a smart boy with a strength quirk. Izuku doesn't have any quirk, Fayumi said, zipping up her jacket. He's quirkless. Hamada frowned. She scratched the back of her neck. You're sure? No toe joint, Izuku shrugged. Hamada nodded, slowly. Izuku's been doing martial arts for a few years now. He's really good, Fayumi said, and he's pretty smart too. All of his teachers think he's great. Izuku flushed. Hamada scratched her chin. It does save me trying to clear up his unregulated quirk use, she said. But honestly, it's hard to remember that some people don't have quirks at all. Izuku nodded. It's pretty rare to be able to do all of those things despite not having a quirk. It's very impressive, she said, appraisingly. It takes a strong spirit, an iron will. Izuku ducked his head, embarrassed. I want to be a hero, he mumbled. You're sure? Hamada asked. Yes, Izuku said, voice a little stronger. Despite everything. Hamada smiled. She caught Izuku's eye, brows furrowing. You can be a hero, she said, eyes hard. Izuku stared at her. Tears started forming in the corners of his eyes. You're sure? Fayumi said, and flushed. Not that I don't think he's capable, it's just you shouldn't get his hopes up. I'm serious, Hamada said. Her pretty face was stony, eyes sharp. I'm an expert on heroes. It's not the quirk that makes them who they are. You can have a child born with the most powerful quirk in existence, but unless they're willing to put the effort in, they won't get anywhere. Shouto Midoriya had an easy life. He woke up early to cook his mother breakfast most days. Although the past week he had slept in, as the end of term approached and he started feeling too tired to wake up early. Some days he woke up too late and had to run to school, toasting bread between his palms as he ran. His only irritation was Bakugo. The boy acted like he had a whole ant colony in his pants, twitching and jerking and snarling wildly whenever Shouto was in eyesight. Whether he did that all the time or not, Shouto didn't know. It was a wonder Bakugo hadn't had a heart attack yet, from how stressed and angry he was constantly. Bakugo had been friendly enough with Shouto before their quirks had manifested. They grew up in the same neighborhood, so were more friends out of necessity. Bakugo had pushed ahead, vying for leadership in all things, and occasionally butted heads with Shouto but not often. This morning, though, Shouto took the long way to school to avoid Bakugo. The last time he'd seen Bakugo he'd ended up freezing the boy's feet to the ground and running. And he didn't look forward to the repercussions of that. He arrived 10 minutes late to homeroom. The class was a mess of noise and movement, and it took him another 3 minutes to navigate to his chair. Yakukawa, one of the Bakugo's friends, tugged on Shouto's shoulder. We're filling out questionnaires for our future, he said. Have you decided what you want to be? Shouto pulled a blank application from the pile on the desk in front of him. A hero, of course, he said. The apartment, which had looked so bare and clean before they had started moving, was cluttered with cardboard boxes and half-emptied bags. The remains of 6 or 7 plastic bags nearly caught Izuku's ankle as he padded up the short staircase. Where's this going? Izuku asked, shifting the television onto his hip. He pushed an empty cardboard box around with his foot. Fayumi looked up from her magazine, feeling suddenly guilty. She had roped Izuku into helping her move, intending to do half of the work herself, but it was all too easy to leave it to Izuku. He was just too dedicated and swift. Fayumi, isn't that, like, 1,000,000 years old? Kumiko, Fayumi's friend and co-worker, poked her head around the doorway. Her long, black hair fell sleekly over her shoulders, like pooling ink. It still works, Fayumi mumbled. Should I just put it down anywhere? Izuku asked, pulling the television in front of him. In the corner, Fayumi decided, it's just going to get in the way, otherwise. Izuku bobbed his head, setting it down in the corner. He jogged outside to collect more boxes from the van. Kumiko turned, her hair cascading down her back. Your kid brother's really strong, she said, nodding towards the television. I couldn't even push that old hunk of junk. It's not a quirk, before you ask, Fayumi said. I wasn't gonna ask. Kumiko folded her ankles. The shining plastic finish on her high heels caught the light like wet paint, reminding Fayumi of pink boiled sweets. I don't really care if it's a God-given or earned. I was gonna ask if I could borrow him. Borrow who? Izuku patted inside, dwarfed by the huge box he was carrying. He set it down at his feet, looking wide-eyed at Kumiko. You, Kumiko said, do you fancy a job? It's good money. He doesn't need a job, Kumiko. Fayumi said, you need to focus on your schoolwork, Izuku. It's not many hours either, Kumiko continued. You get a lot of fresh air. You probably jog, right? You can just do that while you work. What is it? Izuku asked. Just a delivery job, Kumiko said. My husband owns a flower shop. I need you to deliver flowers to places where it's hard to park a van, and to bring heavy soil bags to the shop from the warehouse. Izuku blinked. That's it. Were you expecting something more challenging? Kumiko asked, raising a sculpted eyebrow. What's the catch? Fayumi asked, flatly. Is suspiciousness genetic? Kumiko asked, hotly. It's just a delivery job. Izuku's 14 now. It's just like a paper round but better smelling. If anything funny happens, Fayumi warned. Kumiko gave her an unimpressed look. If that's all, I can do that, Izuku said. I'd love to help. Kumiko jumped up and gave him a sweet smile, lip gloss gleaming. You're such a good boy, Izuku, she said, petting the top of his head. You're so sweet. My hubby will love you. Izuku flushed deeply. Oh, and before I forget, Fayumi, Kumiko turned to her. Your Hamada girl rung the school earlier. She wanted to let you know she rearranged her plans and can make it on Wednesday. Oh, Fayumi said, a little blush coming to her pale cheeks. She pressed her hands to her face. That's good to know. Kumiko swung an arm around Izuku's shoulders, rolling her eyes. And she complains at me being lovey-dovey. Kumiko sighed dramatically. Everyone I work with is a hypocrite. What are you talking about? Izuku asked. Nothing, Kumiko patted Izuku's chest. Come on, let's go in my car. I need to introduce you before Ryo goes on break. Kumiko's husband Ryo turned out to be a mountain of a man, with a grizzled black and white beard and sharp eyes buried under thick eyebrows. He was half Russian, half Tibetan, Kumiko explained in a sweet-voiced rush, fawning over him. His chest was pushing out of his shirt, and his arms were built like train carriages. Izuku was intimidated just by how tall he was, how deep black his eyes looked. Izuku accepted the 2 bouquets of flowers from Ryo. who gave him a long explanation in hushed, croaking Japanese that Izuku had to ask several times for the man to repeat. After pulling on a store shirt, Izuku tucked the flowers under his chin, trying hard not to bend them, and set off. It was early evening, and the city was in full swing. A gaggle of tipsy university students nearly knocked into Izuku, stopping to pet his hair and try to smell his flowers, but he managed to fend them off by breaking into a run. Night was creeping in. A dog tried to bite Izuku's ankles but was told sharply off in a series of barks from its owner, who switched to human language to apologize. Izuku nearly stepped in a puddle, but avoided it in time. The apartment the flowers were due for was on the top floor of a complex near the center of town. He saw the building a few blocks away, a neat silver cube of windows, built between a shopping mall and a wide, busy road. Izuku crossed the road in the crowd, finding the entrance to the building after a bit of confusion. The foyer was dark and empty, and it looked like all the power inside had gone out. He poked a head around the elevator and looked straight into a dark brick wall. Great, Izuku muttered to himself, and tucked his flowers into the kangaroo pocket in the front of his jacket, fastening them with some string. Gotta do it the hard way. Stairs raced by under him as he took them two at a time, jumping over rubbish and trash left on the walkway. He skidded around the bend and raced up another flight of stairs. As he scaled the building, he was increasingly unnerved by how quiet it was. Every footfall seemed to reverberate in the silent stairwell. Finally, he reached the third floor and jumped out into a deserted hallway. The carpet under his feet was cheap and slightly smelly. Nerves started to prickle at the back of his neck, and he checked the scrap of paper Ryo had given him. 306. He walked past the doors, checking their signs carefully. 306 seconds door was ajar. Orange light spilled into the hallway. Izuku knocked lightly on the door. There was a scuffle and a slight whimper. "Who the fuck is that?" a male voice said, quietly. It sounded rough and raw. "You expecting company?" Izuku jumped out of the way just in time. 2 gunshots cracked through the wood of the door, sending a burst of splinters cascading in the dark hallway. There was a muffled thump as the bullets embedded into the carpet. God, if he was a second late. Izuku started at the patch of carpet where the bullets were trapped. "Didn't hear no fucking body fall," the voice came again. There was a thump as someone on the other side of the door stood up. The door threw open. Izuku leaped, cat-like, wrapping his legs around the chest of the attacker, sending them both tumbling into the dark. Another gunshot rang out, close enough to ring painfully in Izuku's ear. It took a moment of fumbling, but Izuku managed to get an arm around the attacker's neck, pressing his windpipe into the bone of Izuku's forearm. The attacker clawed uselessly at Izuku's arms, nails breaking the skin. In a few minutes, the clawing died to nothing, and the attacker fell limp. Izuku kept him there for a few more seconds, before releasing him. Izuku untied the string he'd used to keep the flowers together and tied the man's hands together. As the attacker began to stir, Izuku found the man's gun in the thick carpet. He looked at the apartment warily. "Is anyone else there?" he asked. Did he have an accomplice? It took half a second for Izuku to feel profoundly stupid. He felt like bashing his head against the wall. A hesitant voice came from the apartment. "No, it's just me now." Izuku internally debated trusting the stranger before giving up and choosing the path of least resistance. He kicked the door open and pointed the gun at whatever was moving in the apartment. A middle-aged man was tied up on the living room floor, blood dripping steadily from an ear wound. Light spilled from a few lanterns dotted around the apartment. He looked up at Izuku, eyes glazed over. "Is there anyone else in the, rooms and stuff?" Izuku asked, trying to think back to various episodes of cop dramas he'd seen. The man frowned, a little vaguely. He chewed over Izuku's words, like thinking was exceptionally hard. No, I don't think so." Izuku gritted his teeth, embarrassment heating up his ears. "I'm going to check anyway," he announced, snagging a lantern to light his way. The man tried to shrug with his hands tied. "Fine by me." Izuku spent the next 2 or 3 minutes digging around in the bedroom and bathroom, looking for hidden criminals, but turned up nothing. He returned to the living room and knelt behind the man and untied him. "Who are you?" the man asked, holding his head carefully. He was looking up at Izuku with wide eyes. "Your quirk is really strong." "I'm nobody," Izuku said, quickly, "and also I'm quirkless." "Quirkless?" The man squinted. "Then how did you know I needed you?" Izuku jumped like he'd been stung. "Of course." Izuku tugged a bouquet of flowers from his kangaroo pouch and, after searching for a few minutes, found the other one dropped under the bathroom sink. Both sets of flowers had been thoroughly crushed by the scuffle in the hallway and were shedding everywhere in the apartment. Izuku presented the crumpled flowers to the man, who lifted a hand to knock into one of the buds gently. "Flowers?" the man asked, blearily. "They're for you." Izuku beamed. The man passed out. "Quirkless, you say?" The police officer stood in the hallway of the apartment block. The lights hadn't been turned back on yet, but the sun was coming streaming through the opposite window, hot and golden. "How does a quirkless child?" "He actually looked more like a teenager," the victim said, scratching his chin. 14 or 15, I'd say." It's hard to tell when they're buff, you know. Okay, the police officer said, making no notes in his pad. So you're saying a quirkless teenager was able to subdue an armed gunman sent from the Yakuza? Yes, the victim said, blinking at the officer. And the police officer pulled an evidence bag from his back pocket. Encased in clear plastic was half a dozen crushed flower petals, some bloodied, others still brightly colored. How do you explain these? I think he was delivering flowers, the victim said, shrugging, seemed quite agitated about ruining the bouquet. Right, the police officer said, tucking the flower petals back in his back pocket. Was this before or after the mafia thug clocked you over the head? Are you sure you want to send me out on another delivery? Izuku asked, fumbling with his roses, straightening the buds. The last one didn't go so well. I ruined the flowers and I didn't get any money from him. It's fine, Ryo said, beckoning him closer. Give me your phone. Izuku hesitated and produced his phone, passing it over. Ryo pulled out his own phone and typed Izuku's number into it. He repeated the process with Izuku's phone. Now we share numbers, he said, gravely. He passed Izuku's phone back. Thanks, Izuku said, hugging the roses to his chest. I'll try not to get into any trouble this time. Ryo gave him a knowing look that slightly unsettled Izuku. I swear, Izuku said, stepping out into the rain. No trouble at all. Zilch. 3 hours and a few dozen cuts and bruises later, Izuku was eating those words. He pushed the shopping cart off his side and stood up uneasily. Rose petals were stick to the bottoms of his shoes and rainwater soaked into his socks. Are you all right? Izuku asked, helping up a small girl. She nodded, teary-eyed. Who are you? The girl asked, tilting her head. Her thick, dense curls were drooping with rain, and her dark eyes seemed to peer into Izuku's heart. I'm nobody, he said, not even got a quirk. The monster quirk user was crumpled in the shopping center's garage, tied together with a shipload of duct tape that Izuku and the girl had helped trap him with. You got him, the little girl said. Her voice was a little tired, a little bright. I suppose I did. Izuku scratched the back of his neck. His damp hair was sticking in curls to his skin. The girl stooped and peeled a nearly pancake-flat rose from the tarmac. She held it up to him, dirty red petals sagging, scraps of the paper Ryo had wrapped them and still sticking to them. It's for you, she said. The third time it happened, Izuku was starting to get suspicious. Duck, a passerby howled, and Izuku dropped to the ground just in time to miss a huge tentacle collide with the stone pillar behind his head. Where are the heroes? An old man whimpered, brushing cement dust from his shoulders. A seething mass of tentacles pulsated in the center of the shopping mall's fountain, dark ink spreading across the white tiles. A shopping bag was covered in black. A cell phone bobbed near Izuku's feet. He picked it up, brushing the thick liquid off its face with a frown. The villain let out a howling screech. It burned in Izuku's ears and sounded almost painful. An idea bubbled to the back of his mind. Izuku snatched a switchblade from a newsstand and stabbed it into the nearest tentacle. Howls pierced the air like a knife. The tentacles shot towards him, thick muscle wrapping around the deserted kiosk, shedding newspapers and magazines. The wood of the stall was crunched savagely. Izuku ducked behind the mass and ran to the fountain. Behind the thick mess of tentacles, there was a small, dark body, face and chest crowded with tentacle roots. The girl's hands struggled against the tentacles, unable to grip the muscle that sprouted from her body. Izuku snatched the girl by the middle, heaving her out of the water. The moment the connection was lost, the tentacles vanished. Gently, Izuku set her down on the tiles. Was that me? She asked, looking at the destruction the tentacles had wrought on the shopping mall. A chunk of the newspaper stand floated over to her. Your quirk, Izuku shrugged. I think it was just trying to protect you, since it couldn't really see. It was just reacting on instinct, like kinda an anemone. She blinked up at him and pulled on the tatters of her dress. From the untouched fabric of the back, Izuku could tell it had been a pretty one, yellow with embossed white and red flowers, but the front was torn and soaked with ink. Here, Izuku pulled his shirt off and passed it to her. Mine's got less ink on it. The girl tugged it over her head, shifting it on her shoulders. She pulled at the corners, tears forming in her eyes. I could have hurt these people really badly, she said, choking. I'm really dangerous. Not really. Izuku tensed his arms, flexing. I've got not quirk at all and I still beat you. The girl gave him a watery smile. Izuku pulled 3 crushed dahlias from the back of his pocket. Oh, and I think these are for you. Izuku got another text for Ryo at 3 minutes to midnight, and rolled out of bed, teeth gritted. He pulled on some clothes and snatched his bag up. He had to rein in his irritation a little in order to leave the house quietly enough to avoid waking up Fayumi or Mishio, but he would have really liked to slam the door. City air was cold at night, and bit Izuku's skin. He started to wish he'd remember to bring a jacket or a scarf when he stormed out. Ryo's flower shop was a little out of the way, tucked at the end of a shopping district beside a busy road. People sat in heavy traffic on the street over, looking longingly at the sweet-looking flower shop, with glowing orange windows and buckets of roses sitting outside. Izuku stomped up to the door, which opened before he could knock. What's going on? Izuku asked, stepping inside the store as Ryo held the door open for him. Why does someone want a flower delivery at nearly 1 in the morning? That's not the question you want to ask. Ryo flicked a light on, nearly blinding Izuku. Izuku blinked quickly, trying to adjust his eyes to the light. He winced. It's not, Izuku admitted, rubbing his forehead. How come every time I go to do a delivery, I end up fighting some villain? I had to go to school yesterday late and covered in ink. I didn't even have a shirt. That's a good question. Ryo settled behind the register, pulling a small, worn book from the drawer below. He opened it carefully, spreading out a page. Izuku sat on the chair in front of the register, trying to peer at the pages. It's in Russian, Ryo said, flatly. He showed Izuku the crumpled pages. It just looks like squiggles. Izuku frowned. Cursive. Ryo turned back to the book. This book tells you when there'll be a villain or something. Izuku asked, folding his arms. Ryo flicked through the pages. He sighed softly. My quirk is foresight, he said, voice hushed, like Sir Night-Eye. Izuku asked, perking up. Not unlike, Ryo said. There was a long silence. Izuku glanced over at the thick cloud of daffodils that spilled out of a bucket by the register, a brilliant splash of yellow. He bent down and snagged one, inspecting the flower head absently. When I was 8 years old I had a vision, Ryo started, and stopped. He stared at the daffodil in Izuku's hands. My whole life was laid out in front of my eyes. Everything that would happen, one after another. The choices I'd make. All of it? Izuku asked. All of it, Ryo nodded. Every event I will experience, including my death. Izuku stared at him. By the end of the year, my knowledge of it was fading. Ryo lifted up the little book, but I had already painstakingly recorded all of it. Every week, every day, every hour. So you've just been living it? Izuku asked, just following this book your whole life? I have no choice. Ryo tilted his head. His wiry hair glowed in the shop's orange lights. Even when I try to disobey it, everything happens as predicted. Izuku felt his chest tighten. His despair must have shown on his face, because Ryo laughed. Don't look so gloomy, boy. Ryo patted Izuku on the head, heavily. Even though life may get dull sometimes, I live for the small moments. I knew exactly when mine and Kumiko's wedding would be, for instance, but being there was still the best thing I could have hoped for. So that's why you know when to send me out. Izuku asked. Exactly, Ryo said. Kumiko mentioned you wanted to be a hero. It only makes sense to get a head start on it, especially as you lack a quirk yourself. Yeah, Izuku scratched the back of his neck. But I don't see why I can't just leave it to the heroes. I'm not really cut out for this stuff. That teenager yesterday, Ryo said, wiggling his fingers like tentacles. With a quirk like that, any number of amateurish heroes would simply charge in and attack her, further aggravating her quirk, possibly hurting her and others. Izuku frowned. What about the one that? Would the heroes have been able to save the little girl with nobody around to report it? Or the first one, the heroes wouldn't have investigated a deserted apartment block. You definitely saved that man's life. Ryo shook his head. All of these things, they're things only you can do. You and your heroic soul. Izuku nodded shyly. Yeah, he said, I suppose. Of course, Ryo pressed his big hand onto the flat top of the register. If you are feeling overwhelmed, you can always back out. Izuku raised an eyebrow. You already know I won't. Ryo smiled, closing his book. Yes, I suppose I do. Izuku opened the door gently, stooping to place his shoes carefully on the rack. He shrugged off his jacket and hung it up, the chill of the night still clinging to his feet. There was something strange about the Todoroki house, and it took a moment for Izuku to realize what it was. Voices came from the living room, muted. It was nearly 1 a.m. Izuku crept along the hallway, footsteps muffled by his socks. He pressed an ear to the door. You can't go on keeping things from her, Mishio was saying. There was the sound of fabric rustling. She's not made of glass. Neither's Izuku. What the fuck would be the point? Arata grumbled. He sounded tired and drawn. So Dad was a jackass again, huh? Water's wet. Izuku hadn't heard Arata's voice in nearly a month. Arata had been visiting less and less, spending time with friend and then finally buying his own apartment. Unlike with Fayumi, Izuku never spent any time at Arata's apartment, so he only saw him when Endeavor was at home and they were all rounded up to act like a family. He could have crippled you this time, Mishio grunted. There was a long silence. You can come in, Izuku, Arata said, voice hard. Izuku jumped, scrambling back from the door. He breathed heavily for a moment and then, sheepishly, opened it. Arata was kneeling, shirtless. A burn ruined the skin of his chest, from his belly button to the curve of his shoulder. It was a deep ruby red, split through with dark, weeping cracks. It's a paper door. Numbnuts, Arata said, a muscles tight under his eyes. I could see your shadow. Sorry, Izuku flushed. He eyed the dark burn, stomach churning. That looks really bad. Does it hurt? Arata glared at him. Mishio spread a blob of cream across his fingers and started to dab it along Arata's shoulder. Arata flinched when he touched the cracks in his skin. Blood speckled Arata's white shorts, leaving dark stains in the wood floor. Who did that? Izuku asked. Arata said nothing. Mishio's jaw was tense. He ran a thumb over Arata's collarbone, wiping away a splodge of uneven cream. Who do you think it was, Izuku? Izuku crept along the subway, a clutch of honey-colored tulips tucked under his chin. He mentally searched the people he passed, profiling them quickly. A bug-eyed but otherwise pretty girl was sending him odd looks. Was she the villain? Izuku mumbled darkly to himself, before fixing his eyes on a different woman reading a newspaper, studying her intensely. A beefy-looking Australian man stooped to pick up his daughter, and Izuku turned his full, searing attention to him, staring at the man's long, stiff crocodile tail for a while before dismissing it. Ryo's foresight was making Izuku twitchy. The ideal would be where Ryo told him which person was going to turn villainous. But Ryo had admitted that he hadn't recorded much beyond a date and an event. The rest was totally gone from his head. Izuku gave up. Maybe Ryo had been pulling his leg and this really was a delivery. He knocked on the staff-only subway door near the ticket desk. After a few moments, a tired-looking official opened the door. "Some flowers for you," Izuku said, presenting them. "Oh," the man brightened immediately, picking them up and admiring them. "Any idea who they're from?" "I've not been expecting any." "There's no note," Izuku said, and pulled the clipboard from his bag. "Could you sign for them?" "Oh, of course." The man took the clipboard. An explosion rocked through the tunnel. Dust and wind threatened to tip Izuku over, heat searing the back of his neck. "What was that?" The official pushed the clipboard into Izuku's chest and peering past him to look down the tunnel. Half of the wall had collapsed, rubble falling onto the tracks. Smoke billowed from the hole, thick and arid. From the rubble a monster crawled out, slimy skin as brilliant orange as a gecko. "Time to die, humans." The monster yowled, triangular jaw wobbling. Finally, Izuku muttered, dropping the clipboard. "I'm home," Izuku shouted into the Todoroki house, kicking his shoes off and padding into the kitchen. He still had one canary yellow chrysanthemum sticking out of his back pocket and tugged it out. "Fayumi would like the color." "Welcome home," Emiko Hamada said from the kitchen table. Izuku froze. "How did you get in here?" he asked. "Fayumi gave me a key," she said. Izuku frowned. "Why would she?" "Don't try to change the subject, brat," Hamada said. "I'm not playing games." "You're flowers, aren't you?" Izuku blinked. "Flowers?" he asked. "You know, the vigilante who's been active these last few months leaves flower petals at the crime scene," Hamada said. "That's what they're dubbing him." I heard the witness descriptions and I thought to myself, how many school-aged, quirkless young men do I know with a long martial arts histories who work at flower shops? Izuku winced guiltily. "It's not me." Hamada gave him a flat look. "So I won't find yellow chrysanthemum petals at the next sighting, then?" Izuku hid the flower behind his back. "Coincidence," he suggested, feebly. Hamada rolled her eyes. "You're not in trouble," she said. Izuku stared. "I'm not. But vigilantism is illegal, isn't it? You need a license. You need a license to use your quirk." Hamada waved a hand in the air. "Since you informed a fair number of witnesses that you are quirkless, and no evidence can be found of you using any special powers, the police can't investigate you. Self-defense has always been legal, so I don't have to stop." Izuku asked. "It's fine by me," Hamada said. "I've seen you in action, after all. You're not in any real danger, not with your abilities." Izuku beamed, turning his 100-watt grin on her. "You really think so?" Hamada nodded, sagely. "I think you need a little guidance, though," she said. "Vigilantism could harm your later career. Luckily no video footage has been caught of you yet. None that can identify you, at least. But I think it would be good to use a mask from now on." "A mask?" Izuku gasped. "Like a hero mask?" Hamada laughed. "I guess." Izuku was pretty much always active. When he wasn't delivering flowers or training in the dojo, he was trying to cram in enough time in the early hours of the morning or on the bus in order to avoid failing school. It was hard. He often fell asleep in class or in the dojo. Some days he felt so exhausted he could hardly pry himself out of bed. He delivered Amazon lilies, cone flowers, moth orchids, peonies, cornflowers, busy lizzes. Sometimes he left during break. Others in the morning, most in the evening and night. He smelled strongly of pollen, to the point where it set off a fair number of his classmates' hay fever. Izuku was fairly sure Fayumi knew, based on how much time she spent with Hamada and Kumiko. One evening he'd arrived to the dojo half an hour late with a giant sunflower still sticking out of his bag and one leg soaked with river water, and the dojo master had shot him such a look, but none of them had said anything, so he didn't either. Months passed and he started to adapt. Every fight he felt himself getting stronger. Fighting with villains' quirks in an uncontrolled environment was an entirely different experience to goading Mishio into a fight, and every battle was intense and exhilarating, his mind and body working perfectly in sync. His reflexes grew quicker, his thoughts sharper. Enji was eating at the kitchen table for the first time in 2 months. The atmosphere was cold and the room was silent. Mishio doled hearty spoonfuls of curry onto steaming cones of rice, trying to avoid eye contact with his father. Arata's seat was empty, and had been since Enji had informed them he was coming home. Fayumi passed the plates around, giving Enji a weak smile. Are you intending to go into the army? Enji asked, digging into the curry. He glanced over at Mishio. Mishio jumped and shifted uncomfortably. Not really. I think I'm going to do something academic, like Fayumi. Enji said nothing. There was the dull scrape of cutlery against porcelain, and they ate in silence. Izuku won another trophy yesterday, Fayumi said, forcing her voice to sound bright. Oh, Mishio glanced over at his younger brother. What was this one for? Mixed martial arts, Izuku said, grinning despite himself. I came first in the prefecture. What are you intending to do, Izuku? Enji asked. Izuku froze. The tension in his chest squeezed his lungs, and it took him a moment to form words. I want to be a hero, he said, finally. I refuse, Enji said. Izuku stared. I will not allow you to sully the Todoroki name by applying in your state, he said. That would do nothing but drag down my reputation by association. You would achieve nothing. Dad, Mishio started. This is the last I'll hear of it, Enji said. Izuku's head bowed. The grip on his fork turned his knuckles white, and his hair covered his damp eyes. Izuku Fayumi started. The schoolyard was nearly empty, and the roads were a pale gray. The only people still milling around was a gaggle of students and a few people waiting for the bus down the street. A car rumbled past. Izuku wouldn't look at her. Fayumi wrapped her arm around his shoulders. His skin was cold and his eyes were still raw. Izuku, she said, carting a hand through his hair, I've got an idea. If Dad finds out about it, he'll flip out. And I'm not sure it will even work. Oh? Izuku asked, a mean glint in his eyes. Revenge isn't very heroic. It's not revenge, Fayumi said, leading him down the street. The chill around her ankles sent shivers up her legs and she stamped her foot to send some warmth her way. Izuku waited. Dad's not the most hands-on parent. I don't think he'll notice things quickly, Fayumi said. I was thinking, what if when you're filling out the application, you put me as your guardian and put my apartment's address as your home address? Izuku blinked up at her. What? Well, you need a parent's or guardian's approval to apply, right? Fayumi said. What if we pretend I'm your guardian? That's not too unusual. Pro heroes don't always look after their own kids. Their days are too erratic. Won't they check? Izuku asked, but his mood was visibly brightening. Color was rising to his cheeks. Well, yes, they should do, Fayumi said, but they might not. We might be able to sneak by it. I mean, I've effectively been your guardian for most of your life anyway. Izuku beamed at her. You think it'll work? You think he won't notice? Fayumi shrugged. We can hope. You decided what you want to be yet? One of Izuku's friends asked, leaning over the back of her chair. They had been friends the last year, but Izuku knew that because he couldn't hang out with them outside of school that a gap would always be between them. Izuku looked down at the application sheet. His father's words rang in his ears like bells, but he gritted his teeth. I'm going to be a hero. Himiko rested her hand on her husband's shoulder, watching little Izuku dash across the street, holding a bundle of sword lilies above his head. Their bedroom was directly above the shop, and often acted as a surplus of stock. The entire room was nearly overtaken by flowers of every color. White orchids peppered the bedroom floor with their broad pods. 6 pink lupins that Ryo had been nursing back to health dipped their heads over the bedside table. Himiko had visited family in Kyoto recently and found that she couldn't sleep properly without the rich smell of earth and pollen. Ryo wrapped a large arm around her middle and pulled her closer. It's next week, isn't it? Himiko muttered. It is, Ryo rumbled. Himiko ran a manicured nail over her forehead to brush her hair away. Is Izuku going to be there? Himiko asked. He's there, Ryo said. Himiko pressed her face into her husband's chest. I suppose heroes ought to get used to watching people die. Ryo stroked his wife's head gently. Yes, Ryo said, I suppose he will. The sun was shining. Fayumi carried Izuku's school bag on her back on top of her work bag, despite his protests. The sky was a deep blue, cloud scarce. Izuku tucked a small green carnation into his shirt pocket. It was a gift from Kumiko. The tarmac was hot under his feet. Are you sure we should go this early? Izuku asked. It's UA, so it'll be busy, Fayumi said. Besides, I need to get to school for 9 to supervise and I wanted to walk with you. 2 hours is a bit excessive, Izuku said, but he didn't really mind. He'd bought some quirk fact books to read while he waited, and he was excited to study them. Fayumi hummed. I think I might not walk the rest of the way with you. Actually, Izuku said, is that okay? Huh. Fayumi blinked at him, of course, but why? It's not that much further. I want to go say goodbye to Ryo and Kumiko, he said. Without them I wouldn't have even been able to consider applying. Well, I doubt that, Fayumi said, extracting her arms from Izuku's bag. I'm pretty sure that you'd have applied without any sort of guidance at all. It's not just in order to meet All Might. I think it's in your nature too, to be a hero. Maybe. Izuku pulled his school bag onto his back. Good luck. Fayumi grinned at him. Izuku gave her a quick hug and dashed off, waving wildly. He slowed to a walk a few streets away. Pigeons flocked across the top of buildings. One cat jumped and danced after the birds while another slept, sprawled in a square patch of light. Sunlight glowed across the cat's slowly shifting stomach. Ryo's flower shop exploded. Izuku threw his bag down and was running before he was thinking. He scrabbled in his back pocket for his mask but came up with nothing. He'd left it at home. 6 or 7 cars were upended at the side of the road, smoking. A child howled, trapped between a car and the cement, leg crushed. Broken glass glittered across the cement. The flower shop was utterly wrecked, the front window blown out. Smoke billowed from the windows, dense and black. Ruined flowers littered the street like cast-off clothes. Bleeding pollen that coated the air densely. A monster rooted around behind the register, snapping up coins wildly. "Stop!" Izuku shouted. The monster lifted its head. It looked like an unfinished stone carving, hard flesh jutting out above its eyes, chin cut back too savagely, disappearing into a pillar-like neck. It lumbered towards him, eyes shining. "Kid, get away from there!" a man shouted, pulling his bloodied leg from the broken glass of his car door. "It'll kill you." Fear rooted Izuku to the spot. The other fights, he had been ready for them. He had come into the area with a plan in mind, profiling the area carefully. He knew what he was going to do, or he adapted. It was easy to see it like a game, or a simulation. He tried to force himself to think logically, but he couldn't help but see what was in front of him. Ryo's house, destroyed. All the plants he'd labored over were crushed and bloodied. The dozens of civilians wounded in the street. The monster, who was much larger, much heavier than anything Izuku had seen. Usually quirk users still looked normal in some aspects, but this wasn't human anymore. It was a beast. The monster stepped into the street. It straightened up, taller than the first 2 floors of the building. Its tiny eyes found Izuku and locked onto him, entire body snaking after its head. It turned to him, small teeth grating. Izuku glanced around the street, backing away. There was nothing he could use against it. It was a monster. It was going to kill him. He still couldn't move. The monster's fist came crashing towards him, faster than he could see. He still couldn't move. Something crashed into Izuku's side, knocking him clear. Stars danced in Izuku's eyes, and it took a moment for him to focus his eyes. Ryo lay crushed on the tarmac. Blood pooled around his stomach. Izuku crawled towards him on his hands and knees. Izuku shook Ryo's shoulders. "Ryo?" he asked, tears brimming in his eyes. Blood coated Izuku's hands. Ryo's eyes found Izuku's, one bloodied and red. He breathed shallowly, flicking blood into his wiry beard. Every breath came with a rattle, like an old toy. His legs were incredibly still. "You're gonna be okay, Ryo," Izuku promised, voice thin, trying to move his large friend's shoulders. "You aren't going to die. You aren't going to die." Ryo's eyes drifted half-lidded. He gave Izuku a small, shaking smile. "Don't cry, boy," he said, haltingly. Izuku sobbed. "Hey, you big brute." Mountain Lady boomed above them, her colossal feet hitting the tarmac and shaking the earth. "Why don't you pick on someone your own size?" The civilians began to clap and cheer. "Can you move him?" Kamui Woods, the wood hero, asked, putting hand on Izuku's shoulder. "We can get him to the hospital afterwards, but we need to clear the area." Izuku tried to push a hand under Ryo, but his arms were shaking too much to lift him. It felt like he was self-destructing, ribs crumbling in on themselves. "Could you step back?" Kamui asked, voice soft. Izuku managed to stand, but barely. His ankle had twisted. Wood rose out of the earth, and Ryo was encased in it, deposited gently on the side of the road. Izuku stumbled after him, eyes raw. There was a loud crack as Mountain Lady stood on the monster, burying him in the cement. The monster clawed at the rubble around it, but was effectively trapped. The crowd cheered. Izuku knelt beside Ryo, shaking him awake every time his eyes drifted shut. It became harder and harder to wake him up every time. "Ryo!" Kimiko burst out of her hastily parked car, nearly tripping over her ankles. She dropped next to her husband, cupping his bloodied neck. "God, Ryo!" Izuku watched as she cupped his face, tears sticking to her long lashes. She looked wrecked. Nausea rolled through his gut, mixed with fear and shock. He felt like vomiting. An ambulance arrived and eased Ryo inside. They were in such a rush that they didn't stop to ask if either of them wanted to ride with him. "Is he going to be okay?" Izuku asked, looking up at Kimiko. Kimiko stood in the middle of the road, staring after the ambulance. Her hair was a mess. One of her heels was broken. Her face was so blank. Izuku wondered for a moment if she'd passed out standing up. "Kimiko," Izuku asked, taking her hand. "Kimiko, come to my house. Let's get you out of the road. We can't stay here." Izuku led her by the hand across the street and up the road. Kimiko didn't look at him, tears clouding her eyes. "God, I hope he's wrong this time," she muttered to nobody. They arrived home. Izuku pulled out a seat at the kitchen table for her and bustled about making tea. "He'll be fine," Izuku said, mostly to himself. "He'll be fine. He'll be fine." Kimiko said nothing. "I've texted Fayumi. She'll be coming home soon," Izuku said, emptying a teapot. "I'll stay with you until then we'll—" "Your hero exam," Kimiko said, suddenly. Izuku started at her. What are you talking about? It's in half an hour, she said. You can still make it. Izuku's eyebrows knotted together. A cold, empty feeling unfurled in his gut. It's not important anymore, he said. It is, Kimiko said. Ryo believed it was. He'd want you to go. Tears rolled down Izuku's cheeks. It's not, he said. I've twisted my ankle. I can't go like this. I'll just make a fool of myself. Izuku, Kimiko started. I'll just lose. Izuku said, I couldn't save Ryo. He saved me. I was useless. Izuku, Kimiko stood up. I won't let you throw your fucking life away. Izuku jolted, stunned. Come here. Kimiko beckoned him closer. Izuku hobbled towards her, and she took his hands in hers. Her voice grew soft. I knew my husband was going to die today. He told me the first day he met me. Izuku grew misty-eyed. But, hush, Kimiko ran a thumb over the back of Izuku's hand. I believe in you. You can be a hero. You just need to prove it to the rest of the world. She squeezed his fingers. Here, Kimiko kissed his forehead. Bright orange flowers bloomed brilliantly behind Izuku's eyes for a second. He blinked them away, eyes wide. He muttered. My quirk, Kimiko said, softly, rejuvenate. It should have fixed your ankle as well since it's so recent. Izuku wiggled his ankle. It did. It doesn't really heal much, Kimiko said. It's more like what a good night's sleep could do. Thank you, Izuku said, sincerely. He felt tears forming in his eyes but tried to push them down. Thank you so much. Are you sure? Yes, Kimiko said. Izuku nodded at her and headed towards the door. Wait, Izuku, she said. He stopped. You dropped the carnation I gave you yesterday, Kimiko said. Ryo said you would. Tears threatened in Izuku's eyes again. Here's a morning glory, Kimiko said, producing a beautiful flower from her bag, for good luck. A crowd was already forming outside of the UA exam hall, a strange and diverse mix of quirk users his age, some with odd-colored or patterned skin, others with tails, ears, paws, and some, like him, with no outward clues as to their quirk types. Izuku pushed through the crowd, trying to locate the entrance. He needed to be close to it in case they only let a certain number of applicants through. A tall boy with a chunky tail knocked him into a dense rhododendron bush and apologized profusely. It took Izuku a few moments to escape from his apologies. A flash of red caught the corner of Izuku's eye. He turned and stared. A boy chatted easily with a short girl with a brown bob. The boy was shockingly, stunningly, a Todoroki. His soft hair was split down the middle, half red, half white, with a chunk that hung together in the middle, exactly like Fayumi's. He stood comfortably, hand on the back of his neck like Mishio did. When he opened his eyes after laughing, Izuku saw that the left one was the same cold blue as Enji Todoroki, while the other was gray like Hanako Todoroki. The short girl tapped the boy's arm and ducked her head towards Izuku. Do you know him? The boy glanced over at Izuku. Oh, Izuku blinked. Sorry for staring. I thought I recognized you from somewhere. Maybe. The boy scratched the back of his neck. I'm pretty distinctive. Yeah, Izuku laughed and approached them. I'm Shouto Midoriya. The boy bobbed his head. I'm Ochako Uraraka, the girl said. It's nice to meet you, Izuku said. I'm Izuku. Uraraka waited for a surname, but when she realized it wasn't coming, she just smiled. You're here for the exam, right? Yeah, he said. I'm nervous. You should sit with us, Shouto said. We can work together during the exam. Don't heroes often work in teams of 3? Izuku didn't want to point out that, as they were examined individually, they couldn't really work together. I think so, he said instead. It's a lucky number. Is that a flower? Uraraka asked, looking at the little purple petal that poked out of Izuku's shirt pocket. Yeah, Izuku pulled the flower head out and straightened it. It's a morning glory. For good luck. After a short assembly where he managed to annoy a few people with his constant muttering, Izuku followed the crowd to the training arena. The arena was huge, at least a few dozen square miles judging from how far the walls went in both directions. He supposed when you were training future heroes, no expense could be spared. Izuku kicked at the dusty earth, trying to get Shouto out of his head. For whatever reason, it had never occurred to him that since he had been swapped, there had to be a genetic Todoroki who was living the life he had been destined to. Judging from hair color alone, Shouto probably had to have both quirks. He was the child Enji had been aiming for, would have kept aiming for if Hanako hadn't become too unstable to bear more children. Would Enji have been happy with Shouto as his kid instead of Izuku? Izuku's hands curled into a fist. He doubted it. The doors opened suddenly. Izuku jumped. He had been too lost in his own thoughts to notice the countdown. He ran after the crowd and was quickly lost in the empty streets. A tall robot turned the corner, geometric planes of metal glinting in the sun. It was the same height as the monster from earlier, the one that had killed Ryo. Izuku kept his feet moving to keep himself from freezing up, but he could hardly look at it. His heart was racing. In a burst of sparkles, the robot exploded. A boy around Izuku's age dropped to the cement in front of him. Thank you, you distracted him so well. The boy said, shedding sparkles. We should work together sometime. The boy dashed off, leaving a ghost of twinkles behind him. Izuku stared after him. He ran a hand through his hair. The problem was, the robots were just too big. He couldn't use anything to attack them with or trip them up. He had only really fought human-sized villains. Once they grew larger than a certain size, he tended to chase them around and stall until an actual hero came and stopped them. Shaking heavy thoughts out of his head, Izuku dropped into a sprint. There had to be at least one robot he could take out. Another bot exploded a street over. He was going to lose. Izuku heard the rumble of a giant robot at the other end of the road. It was the kind that had no points, a huge, moving wall designed to intimidate the combatants. Huge and shining, smooth sides gleaming like knives in the sun. It was certainly intimidating Izuku. A dozen combatants passed him in a rush. Izuku squinted at the road ahead of the robot's feet. He thought he saw. His eyes widened. The girl from earlier, Uraraka, was trapped under the rubble. Izuku was moving before he realized what he was doing, charging towards her. His heart was thundering. Palpable, visceral images burned through his mind. Ryo, crushed, Kimiko, sobbing. He skidded to a halt beside her and gripped the cement tightly. Uraraka beamed at him. Izuku, right? When I move it, you've got to get out of there, Izuku said, as fast as possible. Roll, crawl, drag yourself, whatever you can. Uraraka nodded, eyes hard. Izuku rooted himself and began heaving. The cement dug into his shoulder. It was nearly twice his body weight, digging into the meat of his palms. It felt like moving the earth, straining every muscle in his body. He lifted it. Uraraka rolled out, and he dropped it. Weakness rolled through his body. He gasped. The robot's foot crushed cement barely a foot from them. Izuku nearly jumped out of his skin. Izuku wrapped an arm around Uraraka's middle, throwing her on his back and sprinting down the road. The robot chased them, surprisingly fast, and Izuku couldn't stop running. Pain lanced through his ribs. Are you okay? Uraraka asked, leaning over his shoulder. I think, Izuku gasped and coughed, pressing a hand to his chest. Think I strained a muscle. Uraraka tapped him in the center of his chest. Suddenly, Izuku nearly lifted off the ground with every step. It took him a moment for him to adjust, but then he was running faster than he ever had before. This is your quirk, Izuku said, nearly falling over. It's incredible. Uraraka flushed. Thank you. A foghorn blasted through the air, signaling the end of the test. Izuku stopped running. His chest burned, knees weak, arms aching fiercely. He was hurt, somewhere in his shoulder muscles, and it stung bitterly. He set Uraraka down gently. Heart impossibly heavy. Izuku. Uraraka looked at him. Why are you crying? Izuku dropped down next to her. His eyes prickled uncomfortably and he rubbed at them. I didn't get a single point, he muttered. He pulled the morning glory from his shirt pocket, intending to throw it, but instead he just looked at it carefully. Flowers that traveled with Izuku in his shirt or back pocket inevitably got crushed or folded. But the morning glory was still as fresh, and when Kimiko had given it to him, it was a bluish purple, paler in the middle, patterned like a star. The petals were smooth and slightly rubbery against his dirty fingers. Izuku tucked the flower back in his shirt pocket. Maybe he was totally useless after all, he thought gloomily. I think he's hurt too, Uraraka was saying to a short old woman who was wearing a long lab coat. The old woman nodded and gave Izuku a sloppy kiss on his forehead. Izuku jumped. Don't look so down, boy. The old woman dropped a bunch of bright candies into his lap. Have some hard candies. Fayumi texted Izuku as he was leaving the arena, letting him know she wouldn't be able to pick him up. She left a lot string of emoticons after her message, but Izuku hadn't downloaded them on his phone, so he didn't know what they were. He stared at his phone screen. Even though she wasn't coming, he pretended to wait for her, sitting on the stone wall and kicking his feet in the cold air. He had been healed, but a bone-deep tiredness coated his insides. Combatants came out in a dense crowd that thinned as time passed, until it was only a few people milling about. When the sun began to set, Izuku pushed off the wall. Dusk glowed orange between the buildings around the horizon, spilling bright onto the streets. A cat rubbed against Izuku's legs and he stooped to pet her, eyes dull. A garbage truck rumbled past, reminding Izuku vaguely of a huge robot. Walking helped. He fell into a familiar routine. Izuku, a voice called behind him. Izuku turned and saw the Todoroki boy from before the exam. Shouto stared at him, familiar eyes shining. Izuku, I saw what you did in that exam, Shouto said, saving Uraraka like that. Izuku tilted his head. How did you do it? Shouto said, I saw her there too, but I couldn't go and help her. I could destroy robots, but when someone's life is at stake, I can't make myself move. Izuku stared at him. The air around Shouto seemed to grow thick. Izuku's deep, dark green eyes reminded Shouto of his mother, like hard stones worn by a river. There was an intensity in them that was almost hard to look at. What you should be thinking, Izuku started. His voice was quiet, but strong. Shouto watched him. The boy was tough, beaten hard by years of work, a dozen small, faded scars cutting into his arms. Shouto saw the way he moved in the exam, smooth and powerful, like a tiger. It shouldn't be I ought to be a hero, Izuku said, or I might like to be a hero. Izuku raised a fist between them, knuckles white. The noise seemed to die down until the city was silent. Izuku locked his hard eyes with Shouto. It's I must be a hero. Izuku couldn't believe it. He didn't believe it when the letter had come in the mail. He didn't believe it when Fayumi cried and hugged him. He didn't believe it when she invited Hamada, Kumiko, Mishio and Mishio's girlfriend over to a celebratory meal. He didn't believe it when Mishio produced a huge chocolate cake with "You actually gotten you mad bastard" hyped on the top in white icing. Izuku was staring up at UA Academy, at the walls of clear windows, and he still couldn't believe it. The building was beyond impressive. It was recognizable from miles away, a great, shining H that cut through the skyline. The pale pink wall that surrounded it seemed insubstantial in comparison. He crept through the entrance, half expecting the doors to close to him. A large part of him expected it to be a trick set up by his father, and any moment Endeavor would burst from the trees, fires burning, and start beating the snot out of him. Izuku winced. He tried to avoid thinking how angry Enji would be when he found out, but it still prickled in the back of his mind, casting a shadow over his life. Izuku climbed the stairs quickly, checking every door on the way. 1A's door was huge. Pushing it open was nerve-wracking. Izuku was just waiting for someone to realize who he was, really. The door opened. The classroom was shockingly normal. Chairs and tables were arranged regularly in front of a dark chalkboard. About 8 or 9 students sat on around the room, talking, laughing, and, in the case of a mean-looking blonde with sharp, spiked hair, shouting. Izuku stood in the doorway, heart in his mouth. Excuse me, a girl said behind him. Oh, sorry. Izuku stepped out of the doorway, and then he had a good look at the girl. Oh, you're the girl from the exam. You're Araka. Yeah, she smiled. It's good to see that you got in. Hello. A boy Izuku vaguely remembered from the exam said, waving a hand, I'm Idatenya from Salme Junior High School. Salme. Izuku frowned. Isn't that really elite? Yes, Ida said. And you are? Izuku. Izuku said. Izuku. Ida asked, frowning. Yeah, Izuku. Izuku said. Ida like the Ingenium hero. Yes, he is my elder brother. Ada said. And, I must hand it to you, for you to work out that there was a secret point system in the exam. That takes some skill. Oh, yeah. Araka said, I was wondering, do you have an analytical quirk? Or a foresight one? Izuku scratched the back of his neck. No. Is it a strength one then? Ida asked. But it took you so long to lift that cement. Araka rubbed her chin. And it hurt you too. So it's gotta be something you can't really use in battle, right? Like one you can only use against human opponents. Izuku wilted, ears burning. And no, neither of those. Everybody shut up. Something rolled into the doorway, wriggling like a caterpillar. It took a moment for Izuku to realize it was a sleeping bag. The front zipped down, to reveal a worn-looking man with a mess of long black hair. He folded in the middle and wriggled to his feet, dragging the zipper the rest of the way down. He looked deeply disappointed, or perhaps he always looked like that. It took you half a minute to stop talking. He stepped out of his sleeping bag. That's really sloppy. I'm Aizawa Shouto. Pleasure to meet you. I'm the homeroom teacher. Aizawa pulled gym uniform out of his sleeping bag. Please put these on, he said, and go to the training fields ASAP. Do you know Izuku's last name? Ida asked. He stretched, swinging his arms around. The training field was huge and flat. The grass was surprisingly well maintained for such a large area. The field lines were very clean and white. Why would I know? Shouto asked. He started mirroring Ida's stretches, for lack of anything else to do. I saw you two talking after the exam. Ida said, I assumed you knew him outside of school. Izuku is pretty aloof, Uraraka said, appearing behind Ida. He wouldn't tell us his surname or his quirk. Some people just enjoy their privacy. Shouto shrugged. What are you guys talking about? Izuku asked, jogging up to them. Nothing. Uraraka flushed. Izuku frowned. He was sure he had heard his name. What do you think this is about? Shouto asked. Quirk apprehension test. Aizawa announced in his ear. Shouto jumped. A quirk apprehension test. Uraraka echoed. Aizawa stood in front of the gaggle of students. His eyes were bloodshot and rimmed with red, hidden behind a thick clumps of black hair. Izuku finally realized where he knew him from. Aizawa was Eraserhead, a hero who mostly worked underground, and had the ability to temporarily erase quirks. UA High is not your average high school, he said. Here there is no point starting with orientation unless we know, for sure, that you have a heroic potential. Izuku tensed his shoulders. Throughout middle school, you will have done various sports activities. Aizawa continued. These would be a softball pitch, 50-meter dash, grip strength testing. alike. All quirk use was banned from these tests to make it fairer to the other students. The government has not worked out how to standardize tests using quirks. Actual quirk use was limited to supervised time at home, so cutting out school, homework, chores comes to around 3 hours maximum per day. Izuku glanced around the group. He hadn't really thought about it before, for obvious reasons, but he remembered how hard Mishio had found it to summon his quirk even while being attacked. Were people really that disconnected from their own powers? That won't stand for hero work, Aizawa said. You and your quirk need to act as one. So, to have a measure of your potential. We will repeat those tests, but this time you will be able to use your quirk. He fixed his eyes on the angry blonde from earlier. Bakugo, what was your softball pitch in middle school? 67 meters, Bakugo said. Aizawa tossed him a softball. Try using your quirk this time. Don't leave the circle, but don't hold back either. Bakugo caught the ball and stepped into the circle. He gave his arm a light stretch. Got it. An explosion rocked the ground, heat rolling over the crowd. From the heavy black smoke, a ball shot out from the earth, shot like a rocket. Bakugo screamed something unintelligible. Before starting anything, you need what you're capable of. Aizawa turned the screen of his monitor to the crowd. This is the metric to measure yourself against. 700 meters. A red-headed boy muttered beside Izuku. Oh, and before I forget, Aizawa ran a hand through his hair, holding it away from his face. Anyone who ranks last will be disqualified. Permanently. Disqualified. Izuku echoed. Expelled, Aizawa said. Izuku swallowed thickly. You're doing well, Izuku, Uraraka said, while they waited to use the sideways jumping equipment. I mean, you got 80 meters on the softball throwing, and 5 seconds on the 50-meter dash, Ida said, rubbing his chin. All without using your quirk. It's impressive. Thank you. Izuku ran a hand through his hair. Is that your quirk? The redhead, who Izuku had learned was called Kirishima, asked, leaning towards him. His classmates seemed very interested in his quirk, much more than anyone else he'd met. People usually tended to assume he had a quirk like making small things move around, or heating up water, something very unheroic and blasé. Izuku really didn't like being the center of attention. No, I've just been doing intense physical training since I was 8. Izuku pulled his shoulders close to his chest. Not coming clean felt a lot like cheating. But was it really cheating to not use your quirk in a practical exam? It wasn't like he had a choice. You can go next, the bird-headed boy said, giving him a small nod. Izuku sighed in relief. Compared to social interactions, exercise was easy. Time to present the results, Aizawa said to the gathered students. It was nearing midday, and the sun was high in the sky, irritating the top of his line of sight. He shaded his eyes with a hand. The total is just the sum of your scores, since it will take forever to read them all out. Uraraka puffed her chest out next to Izuku, shoulders tense. Izuku didn't really know what to feel, a bundle of nerves twisting in his stomach. Todoroki. Aizawa fixed his eyes on Izuku. Todoroki. Shouto echoed in a whisper, like the number 2 hero. The rest of the class shifted and whispered. Why yeah. Izuku stepped forward. What is your quirk? Aizawa asked. Izuku tensed up. Pardon? Your quirk? Aizawa said. What is it? Izuku clenched his fist tightly. He swallowed. I don't have a quirk. I'm quirkless. Shouto stared at the back of his head. The class was silent. Izuku is quirkless. Aizawa tapped on his tablet, and yet. The scoreboard flickered into life in front of him. He ranks 3rd, Aizawa said. 3rd, Kirishima yelped, even though. But that's, Ida spluttered. That's impossible. Aizawa flicked the screen off. In today's world it's easy to find excuses to avoid heroics. Oh, I couldn't find the time to train. Or oh, my quirk's not suited. This should be definitive proof. There is nothing standing in your way except yourself. Your rankings here are ones that you earned. Aizawa gave Izuku a small smile. He turned to the rest of the class. In short, your failings are your own fault from now on. For a moment, the class was stunned into silence. Then, bit by bit they started talking, until a thick buzz of chatter filled the air. Oh, and I was kidding about the expulsion thing, Aizawa said, and slunk off in the confusion, probably to take a catnap under his desk. You're quirkless. Kirishima caught Izuku's shoulder, yet, you're still so strong. That's so manly. Izuku muttered. Thanks. If you're a Todoroki, why didn't you tell me? Ida tugged at Izuku's other shoulder. That's nothing to be ashamed of. Ida, Shouto hissed. He's the quirkless son of a pro hero. Who wouldn't be self-conscious about that? Don't be so insensitive. Izuku wilted. Surely he's proud, Mina asked. She had pinky purple skin with a white bob curly enough to rival Izuku's. He wouldn't have been, super disappointed or anything, surely. You're still strong. Was he really disappointed? Uraraka asked. Izuku frowned. Well, he kinda didn't pay any more attention to me after I didn't manifest a quirk. He kind of ignored all of us. Silence. Suddenly, Izuku realized how that must sound. Izuku said, straightening up. I'm mostly live with my older sister. He's really too busy to take care of all of us. That's why I don't see him much. That's all right, Asui said, brightly, waving a hand. My parents had to work a lot and I raised my younger siblings. I can't say I didn't enjoy it. Yeah, Izuku grinned at her. It's like. Bakugo snatched the hem of Izuku's shirt. Enough. I don't want to hear this charity case's fucking sob story, he shouted, jerking Izuku forwards. Bakugo, don't fight. Uraraka yelped and looked around for Aizawa, who had already slunk off somewhere. Izuku grinned. He wrapped a hand around Bakugo's wrist. You want something, Bakugo? Shouto frowned at the lack of reaction. Bakugo had just blasted a ball straight into space. His quirk was terrifying. Yet, Izuku just stared the angry boy straight in the eye, without even flinching. You think you could take me? Bakugo snarled, pushing his face into Izuku's. You're nothing. You're useless. Izuku looked bored. Bakugo swung at him. Izuku caught his wrist and redirected him, heat blowing fast across the side of his face. He slammed his other fist into the underside Bakugo's jaw. He heard a sharp crack as Bakugo's teeth snapped together. Bakugo fell backwards and Izuku let go of him, letting him crash to the earth. Blood dribbled out of Bakugo's mouth from a bitten tongue. He coughed, eyes burning scarlet. Your quirk is incredible, Izuku said, offering him a smile, but your fighting style is very lacking. Bakugo roared and leaped at him, twisting into a kick. Izuku darted out of range and used Bakugo's lack of balance to snatch his collar and knock him over. Bakugo's head hit the ground with a crack. I'm not a sobbing schoolboy, Izuku said. I'm a trained martial artist. You're gonna have to do something smarter than swing wildly at me. Bakugo pulled himself from the dirt, eyes shining. His gnashing teeth ground together like a chained dog. He didn't come for Izuku again, but the heat of hatred in his eyes was frightening. You need training, Izuku said. You know how to punch and kick safely, but it's pretty clear you haven't used it for much more than bullying people or small street fights. I don't mind giving you some tutoring. I don't need training from scum like you, Bakugo hissed, rubbing the side of his face. That's incredible, Mina marveled, ignoring Bakugo. You're a martial artist. Can I take you up on the sparring? Shouto asked. I scored last in that physical, even worse than Minta. That's pretty embarrassing. Hey, Minta yelped. I don't know how useful it will be with such a long-distance quirk like yours. Izuku scratched the back of his neck, but being physically fit and strong is always important for a hero. Can I come too? Kaminari asked. Even if I only watch, I think it'd be pretty useful. Me too, Mina said. It sounds fun. Oh, can I? Uraraka asked. My score wasn't very high either. Izuku was nearly overwhelmed, and nodded to everyone. He really hadn't expected this level of enthusiasm. Momo quickly arranged a time after school, gave out Izuku's phone number and told everyone to bring gym clothes. The park was quiet in the evening. A few kids were playing football in the field over, their shouts and laughter mingling with the odd car that passed. The evening air was chill and the grass looked gray in the low sun. Izuku pushed a hand through the grass, rubbing his fingers together. It wasn't too slippery to be dangerous, and the earth was too soft. Damn, he didn't have a reason to postpone. It wasn't that he didn't want to spar or teach his classmates. Some students viewed the rest of their year as opponents, but Izuku's time at UA was so limited that it didn't really make sense to be antagonistic. Nerves jumbled in his stomach. He had never taught anybody else before, beyond giving a few suggestions to his friends in the dojo. Izuku, Uraraka swung over the park fence, dashing up to him. I know we're early, but we wanted to help set up. Is there much to do? Shouto asked, jogging up to him. Not really, Izuku said. I don't have any mats, so we're just going to have to do this on the grass. It's not going to be that comfortable, but as long as everyone had experience fighting, they should be able to protect themselves. Oh, Shouto said. Uraraka looked a little uncomfortable. What is it? Izuku asked. Well, Shouto looked away. I don't have any experience fighting. I got through the exam using my quirk alone. Same, Uraraka said. I took some self-defense classes a few months ago, but during the exam I just dropped some skips on the robots using my quirk. Izuku frowned. Really? Is most of the class like that? Uraraka grinned guiltily. I think Kirishima and Mina have some MMA experience, but I don't know how long ago that was. Tenya has a little, I think, and Momo probably does too, she said, but apart from that, I doubt it. They're fit, but people just assume they'll learn to fight at UA. Mina arrived, wearing a stylist faux fur coat. She gave them a big wave. Kirishima followed her, grinning brightly. Izuku rubbed his chin. I guess I'll start with the basics. He waited until everyone had arrived, or at least most of them. He'd gotten a few texts about having to cancel. He wasn't used to getting so many messages. Usually it was only Fayumi who texted him. All right, Izuku said, when everyone had settled down. The core of fighting is to self-protection. It's easy to get harmed when you fight. You want to do everything you can to avoid that, especially as a hero. He pulled off his shoes and socks, and tugged his shirt over his head. He caught Shouto staring. What? Izuku asked, catching Shouto's eye. Shouto flushed. It's that scar. Izuku looked down. His chest was knobbled with scars and dents, but the most noticeable one was a deep red burn the side in shape of a fist. Izuku pressed a hand to it. "It wasn't my dad," he said, flustered. "It was my brother. He was the only one I could spar with and get them to use their quirk." "Oh," Shouto said, frowning. "Don't worry." Izuku picked up his clothes and tossed them to the edge of the pitch. "He's never won against me." Izuku shook his legs out. "The first thing we're going to learn is falling properly." He lifted his arms and pressed his hands to the base of his skull. "First, most important, protect your head. Don't lace your fingers together, and don't grip the back of your neck. Try to land on your side if possible. It's dangerous to land on your back or front. When you land, breathe out deliberately to avoid winding yourself." Izuku jumped and fell. His side hit the earth with a dull thump, arm slapping the earth, air hissing between his teeth. He rolled into a sitting position. "Oh, and try to spread the weight out as much as possible by sticking your arm out flat," he added. "Also try to roll when you land. That'll help use up momentum and keep you moving. The absolute worst place you can be when fighting is between the ground and your opponent. That's when you can't get away." Izuku frowned, thinking carefully. He had been fighting for so long that every move he simply used instinctively and immediately, without even thinking about it. Actually remembering what he did was pretty hard. "Oh," he stood up and held an arm towards the ground. "Your natural instincts are pretty bad in this regard. You shouldn't try to catch your fall with your arm. It can cause a shock that can go straight to your brain. It might knock you out." He shifted his feet. "You should also really avoid tensing up. It causes more injury." Uraraka blinked to him. Her eyes were slightly unfocused, like she was dazed. "That's a lot to remember," she said. Izuku shifted nervously. Mina threw her heavy coat off, beaming. "Can I go first?" Izuku trained them slowly. It took him a while to strike a balance between moving too fast to be safe and not moving forward at all. It also gave him a whole new appreciation for his dojo masters. Training others was highly stressful. He nearly had a heart attack when Kirishima accidentally went to punch Mina while using his quirk. She didn't actually break anything since she had dodged, but Izuku had banished Kirishima to the sidelines for the rest of the evening. Fayumi turned up sometimes, waving a foam finger and cheering whenever anybody, regardless of who it was, won a short match. She brought the excess water bottles, fruit and milk boxes left over from her school class, and quickly became very popular with the exhausted classmate. Izuku taught them defense first, blocking and dodging, before simple punches and kicks. He borrowed boxing pads and boxing gloves from his old teacher and had them work on a flurry of punches and patterns. He saw them grow in strength and attitude, treating fighting seriously. And if he saw a certain angry blonde-haired boy stalking around the edge of the park sometimes, he pretended not to notice him. "It's taking me longer than everyone else," Shouto said from the ground. His chest was heaving. Izuku straightened up. The grass was cold between his toes. "You're less fit than everyone else," Shouto wheezed. He sat up, looking gloomy. "You could have softened the blow." "It's the truth." Izuku shrugged and took his hand, tugging him to his feet. "You rely too much on your quirk. It won't take too long to get up to a good standard. Only a few weeks. You just have to actually do it." Shouto stood, shaking his legs. "Won't that be difficult? I can't really afford a gym membership. You can join me on my morning jogs if you want." Izuku shrugged. Shouto stared at him. "What's that look for?" Izuku asked, tilting his head. "Oh," Shouto frowned. "I always get the impression you didn't like me much." Izuku frowned. "Why?" "You always stare at me," he said. "Maybe I'm just too self-conscious." Izuku watched him carefully. He did look at him often, and sometimes Shouto reminded him so strikingly of his siblings it was freakish. The problem of heritage burned at the back of Izuku's mind, and he couldn't get it out of his head. It felt like he was deceiving everybody, that he was keeping his parents' sins close to his chest. In a way, he was. "I don't hate you," Izuku sighed. "I'm just jealous of your quirk." Shouto stared at him. Then he smiled, awkwardly. "Why? You kick my ass every day." Izuku grinned back at him. "I don't know." White clouds were thin and irregular across the blue sky like cracks in glass. It was quiet and warm. Trees and earth brought a richness to the air, a sense of living that Izuku found deeply refreshing. A dog padded neatly after its owner on the other side of the street, tail wagging like a pendulum. Izuku checked the address a few times, before settling against a cold brick wall. Shouto's neighborhood was wonderfully quiet. It was early on a Saturday and the town seemed to sleep deeply. There weren't even any curtains open yet. Izuku leaned his head back, brick chill against the back of his neck. How would it have been to grow up here? Would he have had fun? Would he have made more friends? Ones who wouldn't be intimidated by his last name? The apartment door opened at the top of the stairs, and a woman glanced out. "He's here, Shouto," she called back into the house. Izuku stared at her. She was soft and round, with gentle features. She had no freckles, but their eyes were identical, down to the deep-rooted flecks of pale green. Her long hair was his exact shade. Her hands, holding the door gently, were his hands. It felt like Izuku's heart had left his body. "My, you look like you've seen a ghost." She smiled and beckoned him up the stairs. It's Izuku, right? It's been so long since Shouto has had friends over. Come in. Izuku forced himself to move, climbing the stairs very carefully. Thank you for having me, he said. You have a beautiful home. The woman smiled at him brightly, patting his shoulder. So polite. The apartment was normal. There was a well-used kitchen, a pile of shoes by the door, a brightly colored poster of All Might hanging over the mantelpiece. A few action figures were pushed on top of books on the bookcase. Izuku tried not to think about it, but ideas popped up regardless. He picked up an action figure. Would that have been mine? Would these shoes have been mine? Would she have fussed over me like she did Shouto? He put the action figure down, something strange and unknowable squirming in his chest. I'm ready. Shouto appeared at the doorway, wearing what obviously used to be his last school's gym clothes. Have fun, his mother said, and Shouto gave her a quick kiss on the forehead. I will, Shouto said, and turned to Izuku. Are you ready to go? Izuku's eyes struggled to focus. Yeah, he said, quiet and vague. Let's get going. Again, Recovery Girl opened the door to Uraraka, who was sporting a bright purple bruise across her cheekbone. Recovery Girl stepped aside to let her inside her office, sending her a disapproving look. You were here yesterday with the same thing. It's not that bad, Uraraka said, quickly, waving a hand. I wasn't even going to come, cause I just walked into a door while I was on my phone. I'm only here because President Mike sent me. Come, Recovery Girl frowned. Seems like a lot of your girls are walking into doors these days. Mina smiled guiltily from the nurse's bed. Endeavor. A reporter leaned over the police tape. She waved her microphone in the air, trying to attract attention. Endeavor ignored her, signing papers on a clipboard. He nodded at an officer, who threw a large sheet of tarpaulin over the ruined corpse. It wouldn't do for the body to be photographed by the press. Luckily, the only reporter that had arrived yet apparently had a smashed camera and was only interested in Endeavor. Endeavor, it's about your son. The reporter tried to push past the officer who was holding her back. Are you proud of him? Any thoughts? The air was thick with the smell of blood and rot. Endeavor turned to her, flaming eyebrows raised. His boots were sticky with drying blood. Proud? He asked, darkly. Why? The reporter beamed, flushed with excitement at being noticed. Why? She shouted. He's the first quirkless student at UA Academy, after all. Fire burned bright along Endeavor's eyes, white-hot and raging. Izuku dreamed about his biological mother for the first time since he was 5. Way back, when he had first learned that Hanako was not his biological mother, he had dreamed of his real one. He dreamed she had hair like his, eyes like him, had the same small speckled freckles. She was quirkless too, and would let him watch television all night, and wouldn't get upset with him for not finishing his vegetables. The fantasy was short-lived, however, not all that interesting to a 5-year-old boy. It was quickly replaced by dreams of All Might needing his help to finish off a villain, or of him suddenly developing a totally incredible quirk which impressed everyone. Izuku's dream wasn't a long one. He was standing in the hospital ward. The windows were open, blowing freezing air into the bleached room, tugging at Izuku's hair. His mother, Shouto's mother, was sitting on a hospital chair. Her dark hair was pulled up into a bun and she was sitting facing him, ankles crossed. She seemed to be dressed formally, in a pale peach blouse and dark skirt. She pushed her soft hands into her lap. Identical eyes met. His mother's eyebrows knitted together. She looked sympathetic, confused. I don't understand, she said, but it was Hanako Todoroki's voice. The same fragility, the same waver that he remembered vividly. What's wrong? Izuku asked. He wanted to go to her, but his feet were rooted to the blue plastic tiles. His mother pressed a hand to her mouth. She looked up at him, eyes shining. Who are you? Izuku woke up with tears in his eyes. Shouto slowed to a stop, chest burning. His legs hurt, but it was a good hurt, a healthy burn. He leaned heavily on the cold metal railings, trying to catch his breath. Izuku stopped next to him. Water. He offered him a bottle. Shouto took it. Thanks. It was a nice day. The city seemed to glow in the sun, and everything seemed fresh and new. Healthy trees bordered an empty road, crowded with clean, sparkling parked cars. Shouto leaned against a tree, taking a long drink of cold water. You're getting much better, Izuku smiled at him. His eyes were slightly dull, not half as intense as Shouto remembered. Thanks, Shouto passed the water back to him. All these little aches and pains that I used to have, they've all gone. Yeah, Izuku pushed the water bottle into his bag. You'll feel a lot better. Do you want to get something to eat? Sure. Shouto followed him down an alley and into a small market. It smelled interesting, and every stall had a pile of unique products in front of it. One had a set of strange-looking buns and bread rolls. Another had long rolls of bright patterned fabric. Shouto nearly got left behind looking at some fine jewelry. This place is so cool, Shouto said. Izuku said, and yawned. You all right? Shouto asked. Didn't sleep much, Izuku said, and pulled Shouto towards a small yellow stall. 2 chocolate slices please, he asked, sitting down in front of the counter. You. The shopkeeper, a dumpy-looking middle-aged woman, pointed at Izuku. It's you. You're back. Izuku grinned. You know I had those petals framed. The shopkeeper pointed to a frame that hung behind the till, holding half a dozen rose petals. That was just after, the mask started to be a thing. Izuku scratched the back of his neck. Yeah. What's she talking about? Shouto asked, frowning. Nothing, don't worry about it, Izuku said. Shouto watched him carefully for a long moment, but was distracted when 2 large chocolate slices were placed onto the counter. Oh, Shouto jumped. I didn't bring any money. No charge. The shopkeeper beamed at Izuku. It's the least I could do. That vine quirk guy must have left a few scars. Huh. Let me pay at least, Shouto said. No, the shopkeeper waved at him. Izuku shrugged noncommittally and took the plates of cake. Thank you, he said, and gave the shopkeeper a little nod. Wait, why did she give you those? Shouto asked, jogging after him. Are you in the habit of questioning free food? Izuku asked. Izuku, Shouto grabbed his friend's shoulder. Stop this. Izuku stared at him. I'm your friend, Izuku, he said. You've got to stop pushing me away. Izuku gripped the paper plates tightly. The paper bent, sagging from the weight of the cake. You wouldn't tell us your last name. You wouldn't tell us you were quirkless, he said. But when we found out, nobody treated you badly for it. Hell, I had a lot more respect for you. Shouto let go of his shoulder. You don't have to tell me everything, but you should know that you can if you want to. Izuku shrunk away from him. He sighed, from deep in his lungs. I'm not. Izuku looked away. I'm not sure if I can. Shouto frowned. Here, Izuku passed him a slice of cake. He took a big bite of his own. Shouto took it and stared down at it. You're flowers, aren't you? Izuku choked. After a long fit of coughing, while Shouto rubbed his back apologetically, Izuku eventually got enough air in his lungs to reply. What? He asked, rubbing his mouth. Flowers. That quirkless vigilante who was active in your area always left flower petals everywhere. Shouto said. That was you, wasn't it? How did you know? Izuku asked, staring up at him. You aren't exactly subtle, Shouto said, flatly. Anyone who thought about it even a little could work it out. Izuku shifted, uncomfortably. Yeah, that was me. Shouto looked at him for a long moment. His mismatched eyes were unreadable, staring straight into Izuku's like he was about to say something, but was reluctant to actually open his mouth and start talking. He shifted his fingers, sticky from the chocolate icing. What? Izuku asked. Shouto looked away, with an air of resignation. Thanks for the cake, he said. You sure you can carry all of that? Uraraka asked, peering at the load Izuku was shifting onto his shoulders. It was late. The park was dark and the stars were starting to struggle through the city sky. I'm fine, Izuku smiled at her. Thanks. We should be thanking you. Meina beamed. She gave the air 3 punches in quick succession. Being able to fight properly is so cool. Izuku grinned. I should get going, he said. I don't want to keep the boxing teacher waiting. And it's already pretty late. Meina nodded. See you tomorrow. Yeah, Izuku said. See ya. He headed off down the street. Bye. Uraraka jumped and waved. Izuku waved at her. He walked. A sense of calm coated Izuku's mind, and he felt pleasantly tired. The bags were filled with boxing gloves and pads as well as some knee pads, and while they weren't heavy, they were awkward. Night stilled the city. His shoes were cold. Izuku, Enji Todoroki said behind him. Izuku turned on his heel. Enji stood behind him, still in his hero outfit. He stood nearly a foot taller than Izuku. Black costume stretched out his thick, taut muscles. Flames rolled from his chest and feet like a mane, glowing bright in the dark of the evening. Izuku dropped his bags quickly, rolling up his sleeves. He lowered himself into a fighting stance, clenching his fist. I'm not going to fight you, Izuku. Enji took a step towards him. You wouldn't last against me. I'd kill you. What do you want? Izuku yelped. Fear sparked and popped in his chest like chewed wires. I've been too lenient with you, Enji said, voice low. Allowing you to live with your sister, allowing you to waste time in those pathetic dojos. You can't train yourself into growing a quirk, you fool. I don't need a quirk, Izuku said. You have no idea what I'm capable of. Enji stopped walking, a pace from Izuku. His eyes were bright and dangerous. You will not be returning to UA, he said. You will be attending a boarding school in Okinawa until you turn 18. After that, you may return home or stay there. I have no preference. What? Izuku stared at him. Something crumbled inside him. You heard me, Enji said, eyes narrowed. I am only saving you from yourself. You are useless, Izuku, and unsuited to hero work. Pain spiked through Izuku's insides like swallowed glass. Tears choked his throat. You can't do that. Izuku yelled. You can't. I passed the exam. I scored 3rd on the apprehension test. Doesn't that mean anything? You are nothing, Izuku, Enji said. You will never be a hero. Izuku swung at him. Enji caught his wrist and bent his arm backwards, slamming the boy's chest into ground. Izuku's head hit the cement savagely, stars bursting behind his eyes. Blood filled his mouth from a bitten tongue. You are a fool, boy, Enji shouted, holding Izuku's head down. Take my gifts at face value. You are nothing without a quirk. This is a mercy. The hero's boot pressed into the side of Izuku's head, twisting his arm behind his back painfully. Izuku's cheek grated against the uneven tarmac. Enji held him there, humiliated, for a long second before shifting off him. I am going, Endeavor said. If I hear any more of this nonsense, just know that I won't be this lenient next time. He left without looking back. Blood pooled under Izuku's cheek, mixing with his tears. Slowly, bit by bit, he picked himself up. Blood ran from his raw cheek, sticking uncomfortably to his shirt collar. The night was cold and his face was burning. He held his head in his hands and sobbed. Fayumi opened the door and her face fell. Izuku stood on the doorstep. He was a mess. One cheek was grated raw and bleeding scarlet. He held his arm awkwardly. His eyes were red and raw from crying, and he was shaking. Fayumi pulled him into a hug and he broke down again, sobbing heavily into her shoulder. When he had calmed down enough, Fayumi pulled him into the sitting room and wrapped him blankets. She dressed his wounds in gauze and gave him a heat pack to put behind his shoulder. She brought him hot cocoa, which he didn't even acknowledge beyond a quiet thank you. She turned on the hero channel and turned down the volume so it wouldn't disturb him too much. None of it seemed to work. Eventually, Fayumi produced the All Might stickers she had stolen from her work, showing him one of All Might giving a big thumbs up with good job, written underneath him in bold. You could put these stickers on your studies, she said, like when you pass a test or something. It'd be cute. Tears burst into Izuku's eyes. His shoulders shook. Oh, Izuku. Fayumi dropped the stickers and wrapped her arms around him. What's wrong, kiddo? What happened? Izuku buried his face into Fayumi's neck. He breathed shakily. Was it? Fayumi frowned. Was it something Dad did? Did you see him? Yeah, Izuku mumbled. He found out. Fayumi's heart sank. He said he was going to send me to a boarding school in Okinawa, Izuku said quietly. Fayumi squeezed him tightly. I'm so sorry, Izuku, she said. I shouldn't have let you go there. It was a stupid idea. I just set you up for failure. No, Izuku muttered. I passed the exam. He's the only reason I can't be a hero. Yeah, Fayumi rested her head on his. Steam curled from his cocoa. On the television, they were replaying a fight where All Might was fighting a host of alien-like villains which multiplied every time he hit them. Eventually, he simply dispatched them all in one massive blow. The wind from the hit was enough to shatter glass in the buildings a square mile from the fight. You know, Izuku, Fayumi said, tugging his blankets up around his arms. I don't think it matters whether you go to UA or not. No, Izuku looked up at her. Not really, she said. Emiko already said what you were doing was technically legal anyway. And just think about all those people you've already saved. They might not have been saved my heroes, because they didn't really get there in time, did they? Izuku shifted further into his blankets. He frowned. Fayumi shrugged. I don't think you need a piece of paper or a special certificate in order to be a hero. I think you already are one, in my book. Izuku sighed deeply. Maybe, he said. Fayumi patted him gently. I think you should go to bed. It's been a tough day, and it will all seem better in the morning. Izuku rolled off the sofa, rubbing his raw eyes. Good night, he said. G-night, Fayumi smiled at him. Izuku couldn't sleep. In the dark of his bedroom, all he could see was his mother's face. He imagined that white hospital room, those billowing curtains. Who are you? She asked, over and over. Who are you? Who are you? His mind reverberated the question like a struck gong. His thoughts quivered. Who am I? Who am I? Who am I? He rolled over and pressed a pillow into his face. Where's Izuku? Shouto asked, interrupting the homeroom teacher. Aizawa stopped talking, regarding him coolly. Izuku Todoroki will not be returning to school, he said, flatly. Kirishima's head jerked up. Why? What happened? Hero Endeavor removed his son from the school due to Aizawa pulled a note from his back pocket. Physical circumstances. Did something happen? Uraraka asked. Was he hurt? Physical Shouto gripped the edge of the table. Do they just mean that he's quirkless? Is he okay? Mina asked. Izuku is unharmed. His father thought it was inappropriate for someone without a quirk to attend the school. Aizawa's voice was flat and dulled and his eyes were unreadable, but there was a certain edge to his gaze. His jaw was tense. It is Endeavor's choice whether or not to allow his son to attend the school. This is the last I'll talk about it. Fayumi had the next morning off, so she cooked Izuku a decent breakfast which he ended up not eating. Instead he fell asleep in front of the Hero Network, spoon still clenched in his hands. When he woke up, Fayumi had put a pillow under his head and tucked a little letter into his shirt pocket. Izuku stood up and stretched. He cleared away the cold breakfast, turned off the television and pulled the note from his pocket. The letter from Fayumi was asking him to deliver some cookies to Kumiko. In the margin, Fayumi had drawn a little Red Riding Hood with 4 freckles on each cheek. Izuku stepped out into sunshine. His heart was still heavy and his cheek was stiff and scabbed. But he took a moment to soak in the sun. He locked the house behind him and stepped into the road. Hey, someone shouted, sprinting down the street towards him. Hey, you. Izuku glanced up. A girl was sprinting towards him, dark hair fanning out behind her. She had high, flat cheekbones and a warm complexion like burnished gold. Izuku recognized her but couldn't place her. You, Izuku, man, you are a hard guy to track down. She skidded to a halt, panting. Oh, is it okay if I call you Izuku? I guess I don't really know you all that well. You can call me Minami, but I'll call you Todoroki if you like. Izuku frowned. It's okay. Minami stared at him and smiled guiltily. I guess you don't recognize me, huh? Izuku scratched the back of his neck. No, sorry. Were we classmates? The girl straightened up. Maybe this will jog your memory, she said, and began to unbutton her shirt. Whoa, Izuku jumped. Don't, we're in public. People can see. Minami laughed. Chill, she said, and opened her shirt. Under her school shirt there was another, dirtier one. Ink stained the back and the edges, and it was torn in the corner. RYO's flower shop was emblazoned over one breast. Oh, Izuku laughed. You're the octopus girl from the shopping mall. And your flowers, Minami said. I've wanted to thank you for ages, but I didn't know your secret identity. After you passed the UA exam it was pretty obvious, though. Yes, I suppose I was never subtle, Izuku smiled shyly. Anyway, Minami gripped his shoulders, a flush rising to her face. I wanted to thank you. I applied to Ketsubutsu Academy and I got in. And it's all cause of you. I can't thank you enough. Well, you're the one who passed, Izuku said, flustered. It's really your achievement. I couldn't have gotten in if I was doing time for using my quirk in public, Minami said, smirking. I guess not, Izuku said, after a pause. Minami released his shoulders and jumped back. Anyway, it was more than that. The way you dealt with me calmly and sympathetically, even though I was acting really wild, she said. And I thought to myself, this is what a hero is. Izuku flushed. Heat rose to the tips of his ears. I wanted to give you this, Minami said, and produced 3 dahlias from her bag. They were a bright, beautiful purple, their petals still perfect and whole. Thank you, Izuku said, smiling. Thank you so much. They're beautiful. Let's be great heroes together, Minami said, clenching a fist tightly in the space between them. Plus ultra, she shouted. Izuku grinned, tiredly. He clenched his fist and held it next to hers. Plus ultra, he shouted back. Ryo's flower shop sat without a sign. The outside painted a dull white. The shop had been fixed up by the insurance company, and the walls had been rebuilt neat, strong, and bare. Broad windows looked into an empty shop floor and a pretty woman with rolled sleeves and dark hair in a messy bun. She was mixing fertilizers. Izuku pushed the door open, and the bell above it tinkled. Kimiko looked up, brushing dirt from her hands. Good morning, Izuku. She frowned at the clock. Shouldn't you be in school? Izuku wilted. My dad kicked me out, he said, cause I don't have a quirk. Kimiko nodded sadly. I thought he might. Izuku sat down on the only chair in the shop, tucking his legs under it. The smell of turned earth was nice, a little comforting. What did you bring? Kimiko asked, peering at the basket. Izuku straightened up and passed her the note. She read it quickly and smiled at Fayumi's doodle in the margin. I hope she's not suggesting I'm a grandma, she said, and uncovered the cookies. She offered one to Izuku, but he waved them off. Kimiko ate in silence. The clock ticked. Cars rumbled by outside the window. If Ryo were here, Kimiko said, lightly, he would probably have some clear and very accurate advice for you. Izuku smiled. The thing about decisions, Kimiko said, brushing cookie crumbs from her hands, especially really tough ones. It may sound strange, but sometimes you've already made up your mind. It just takes a while to accept your own decision. Izuku frowned. It's like when Ryo proposed, Kimiko explained. It took me around 2 months to decide whether I was going to marry him or not. It felt very surreal to be playing along to his little book, and a large part of me disliked how fatalistic he was, how accepting of his own death he was. Izuku watched her carefully. Her eyes were a little bright, her perfect eyebrows knitted together for a short moment. Her long, silky midnight hair spilled over her front, catching the yellow light in waves as she moved. But in reality, I always knew I was going to marry him. From the day I met him, basically. Kimiko tapped her lips, flipping her hair over her shoulder. So I think it's possible that you know what you're going to do. You knew the moment that bastard expelled you. Izuku looked at the floor, following the irregular trails of dropped soil. He rubbed his eyes. I suppose I do, he said. Izuku dreamed he was in the hospital again, plastic sticking to the soles of his shoes. He stared at his mother like staring at a rabid dog, deciding if he should fight or run. Who are you? She asked. Her voice was strained and cracking. Izuku stared back at her. It felt like there was an emptiness, like he was carrying around a void inside him. You mean you don't recognize me? He asked, heartbreaking. Izuku attended school the next day. For whatever reason, his past still worked, and his legs carried him through muscle memory to his classroom. He was even more on edge than he had been on his first day. The threat of Enji Todoroki was intense and immediate, heightened by the pain from his scabbed cheek. He pushed the classroom door open shyly. Izuku, Uraraka nearly jumped out of her seat. you're back. Did you sort things out with your dad? Kirishima asked, leaning towards him. Kinda. Izuku squirmed. I'll sort it out with him later. What happened to your cheek? Ida asked. Izuku rubbed the scabs. I don't really want to talk about it, he said, quietly. He took his seat and ducked his head. You missed a really good practical, Kirishima said. We were put into hero and villain teams and we had to fight each other. It was really exciting. Are you alright? Shouto asked, and his eyes reminded Izuku so much of Fayumi it was hard to look at. Doesn't he deserve to know? Izuku rubbed his eyes. Don't they both deserve to know? Izuku, Shouto touched his shoulder. You're kind of zoning out. I don't want to talk about it, Izuku said, and buried his face in his arms. He made it to English class. The class was a wide mix of abilities, so Present Mike had to go over things several times. Izuku knew Shouto found this tedious, but since Izuku ranked in the low end of the ability spectrum anyway, he didn't really mind. Shouto was doodling absently in the corners of his notebook, having finished the question 5 minutes ago. Izuku was struggling badly and was teetering on the edge of peering over at his paper and cheating. Present Mike was explaining the question carefully when the door burst open. Enji Todoroki stood in the doorway, fire burning hot enough to singe the top of the door. Fear shot through Izuku. Endeavor. Present Mike frowned. What are you doing here? Izuku, Enji said, gripping the door frame tightly. With me. Wait. Izuku started to stuff his books into his bag, hands shaking. Leave it, Enji shouted. You won't need it. Izuku shoved his pencil case into his bag, nearly dropping it from his shaking fingers. I said. Enji strode across the classroom and tipped Izuku's desk over, sending his books and pencils scattering across the floor. Leave it. He snatched Izuku by the front of his shirt and dragged him out of the class, throwing him into the hallway. The moment Izuku regained his balance, Enji snatched his wrist and dragged him down the stairs. Enji's grip on Izuku's wrist was crushing, and the way Enji tugged him around roughly meant he lost his balance, often tripping over his own feet. Fear sparked in him, and he realized he was crying in terror. He had never really considered what Enji would do when he was properly, truly pissed off, and the thought scared him witless. Enji kicked open a staff door and threw him inside. You're testing my patience, boy, Enji boomed. After all I have given you, all the chances you've gotten, you throw all of that back in my face. All for your own delusions of grandeur. Izuku stumbled to his feet, clenching his fists. I was going to allow you time to adjust to your new school, Enji growled. But now I see I must be firm with you. You are leaving in an hour for Okinawa. I will not allow contact with your siblings or any of your friends from school, and you are prohibited from leaving the school grounds or socializing out of school hours. Maybe that will teach you some respect. No, Izuku said. Enji narrowed his eyes. The air grew thin, like a storm was passing through. No, he asked, darkly. Izuku gritted his teeth, heart pounding. You're forgetting who's keeping your secrets, Endeavor, he said. The fact is I'm not your child. I never was. Enji stared at him. His eyes were hot and angry. What are you saying? He asked, voice dangerous. If you kick me out again, Izuku said, I'll tell the world your wife stole me when I was a baby and you've been keeping her secrets for 15 years. You might not submit to a DNA test, but Fayumi or Mishio will, and that'll throw enough doubt onto your reputation to ruin you. Enji's eyes widened and then narrowed. He gritted his teeth, shoulders tight. I would. Izuku raised a fist. They have internet in Okinawa, I presume. A fist caught the side of Izuku's head square on, and he hit the wall hard enough for his eyes to go black for a moment. Pain seared through his skull and he couldn't think. His body convulsed in shock. Enji's hands wrapped around his neck, pinning him to the wall. Izuku's legs kicked thin air. You little demon, Enji hissed, pressing his thumbs into Izuku's jugular. You're disgusting. I should have killed you when you were a child. I should have buried you along with my fucking witch wife. Izuku couldn't breathe. His chest wouldn't expand. Blood filled his head, pressing into his eyes, heat burning around his face. Bile rose in his throat but couldn't get past the tight band of fingers around his neck. He batted uselessly at his father's hands, nails digging into fire-laced skin. Roaring filled Izuku's ears, eclipsing all noise. It felt like his eyes were going to pop out of their sockets. Black encroached on his vision and his gaze wobbled. Oh God, he thought. I'm really going to die. He's going to kill me. Izuku heard the door open. Enji dropped him. Izuku coughed harshly, dragging in huge gulps of air. His head felt light and tingling, and he wondered if he was going to faint. Endeavor, a voice asked. It sounded tired, but concerned. Endeavor, who's that? Enji pushed past the stranger, kicking the door open. Izuku, my boy. The stranger dropped to his side. Are you all right? What happened? Izuku vomited on him. The stranger rubbed his back sympathetically. Izuku tried to apologize, but no sound made it through his windpipe except a raw gurgle. The stranger was thin and wiry, with a crown of scrappy blonde hair. His eyes were rimmed with black, bags on bags, 2 long sections of his head folded oddly, hanging at strange angles. As sore Izuku finally managed, heaving. Don't apologize, my boy, the stranger said, rubbing his back comfortingly. He wrapped an arm around Izuku and helped him up, although Izuku couldn't help but get the impression that if he put too much weight on the stranger then he would the one collapsing. You can't help being ill. Izuku nodded weakly. I'm Toshinori Yagi. The stranger passed him his ID card. Izuku looked at it through wet eyes and nodded slightly. He rubbed a hand across his neck. Toshinori seemed to notice the marks on his neck. He stared at them, eyes hard. Before I was walking in, was Endeavor strangling you? Izuku shook his head. He did a bit too hard and ended up holding his head to stop the world from spinning. Fear and embarrassment clutched at his heart. And no, he managed. Just breathing hurt. Toshinori stared at them, and then met Izuku's eyes. Warm blood ran down from Izuku's hair and he clapped a hand to the back of his neck. Oh, GG. God, he said, and gestured wildly towards the door. He hobbled out as fast as he could, trying to hide his neck from other teachers. Izuku. Shouto waved at him, head perking up. He stepped away from his apartment gate. Shouto's neighborhood was quiet as ever, and the sudden noise nearly made him jump. Izuku looked up. Izuku nodded at him, breathing softly. He had spent nearly an hour in front of the mirror trying his best to hide the marks over his neck, and had eventually simply tied a bandana around it. A butterfly bruise spread over his throat, purple, yellow, and red, tender to the touch. He tugged at his bandana, pulling it up. I didn't know if you were coming. Shouto held Izuku's bag out to him. You left some of your stuff at school. Thanks, Izuku said, voice creaking and whisper thin. He took the bag and pulled it over his shoulder carefully. Shouto was looking at him. Fingers probed Izuku's cheek warily. The bruise there was huge and swollen, a thick stripe of bulbous purple. Too much skin had broken to cover it with makeup. Instead, Izuku had simply cleaned and treated it. Each of Enji's knuckles were visible in his face. It's fine, Izuku said, voice brushing inaudible. He pulled his head away from Shouto's fingers. I sorted it. Did your dad do that? Shouto asked. His voice held so much sympathy and pain that it made Izuku's insides twist. Izuku knew how it must have looked, how obvious it was. He remembered Enji flipping the desk over. He remembered him snatching the front of his shirt and dragging him into the hall. He remembered his own shaking fingers and whimpers. Izuku closed his eyes. How the hell do you figure everything out? Izuku said, pressing the heels of his hands to his eyes. His throat hurt savagely. Am I that transparent? Izuku. Shouto started, but didn't know how to finish. Don't tell anyone, Izuku said, gripping Shouto's shoulders. Don't. Shouto stared at him, eyes bright. Izuku, I'm only trying to help you, he said. You can't expect me to just leave this. Don't. Izuku shouted, and his throat caught. He coughed harshly, blood filling the back of his neck. His shoulders seized, coughs flecking blood over Shouto's gym shirt. Shouto, what's wrong? Shouto's mother stepped out of her apartment. Oh, Izuku. She dashed down the stairs. Izuku, what happened? Do you want to come in? No. Izuku stepped back. His arms shook. Didn't they both deserve to know? Did something happen? She asked. Is it a sports injury? Shouto told me you did a lot of dojo training. Did you have a fight? She looked genuinely concerned, like seeing him hurt her too. Her hands were clasped in front of her chest, but she lifted one, like she wanted to touch him but didn't know how. Pain and sympathy darkened her eyes. Shouto told me, she had said. She only knew him as Shouto's friend, as Shouto's trainer. She called him Izuku only because Shouto had told her he didn't like going by Todoroki. She didn't know him at all. You don't recognize me. Izuku turned on his heel and ran. Izuku, wait. He heard the thunder of Shouto giving chase, but while the other boy might have improved, he was nowhere near Izuku's level. Izuku leaped over a garden fence and skidded through a narrow walkway, losing the quirk user in a crowd of sad morning shoppers. Izuku. Fayumi beamed at him when she opened the door. You're back early. I didn't go on a run, Izuku said sourly, slipping past her and heading towards the kitchen. Fayumi trailed after him. I found those dahlias in your room. Fayumi pointed to the pot in the center of the table. So I repotted them and gave them a good water. They're very pretty. Do you know who they're from? An admirer, maybe. Izuku thought of Minami. How happy she was to see him. He thought of the tentacles that had taken over her face, the all-encompassing quirk that nearly killed her. In a way, I suppose, he said. Fayumi paused. Her eyes were damp. She cupped his cheek gently, careful not to touch his wounds. You don't deserve this, she said. You never deserved any of this. Izuku leaned into her hand slightly. His eyes closed. He hummed in half-hearted agreement. The hospital, again. Izuku knew he was dreaming. He knew he couldn't look too closely as the wispy white walls around him, in case they dissipated and plunged him into a different dream another time. He kept his eyes focused on his mother. Mrs. Midoriya kept her hands folded on her lap. She didn't reach out to him. Slowly, her eyes lifted from the floor to meet his. Twin sets of dark green, like shadows and jade. She opened her mouth and closed it, eyebrows knitting together. Who are you? She asked, quietly. Izuku turned away from her, head lowered. I'm nobody, he said. Water rolled against the rocks, like a constant, drawn-out sigh. Dark water spun white at the edges of the pier, filling the air with the choking, briny smell of the ocean. Seafoam spat into Shouto's face and he recoiled, rubbing his cheeks. "Why are we here?" Shouto asked. Izuku pulled his bag from the back of Mishio's truck and swung it over his shoulder. "You waited the 3-hour drive to ask that?" He frowned. "I thought you already knew." "It's a vacation." Shouto looked at him like he'd gone mad. "You don't take vacations." Izuku laughed. "You're right. It's training related." "Attaboy." Mishio laughed, slamming the boot shut. Mishio was Izuku's older brother, but you wouldn't know it by looking. Mishio was a head taller than Izuku, and had sharp, spiked white hair with an uneven underside of scarlet. He was built like a gym rat, with a flat, hard stomach and boxy arms. In manner, he acted similarly to Izuku, and shared the same easy laugh, but he had a certain bluntness that Izuku lacked. Mishio was nice, but he had the same problem that Izuku had to start with. There were moments when he couldn't tear his eyes off of Shouto, and there was something almost fearful in his gaze. It was gone just as soon as it arrived, but it still left Shouto feeling unsettled. "Thanks for the lift," Izuku said, grinning at him. "Nah," Mishio locked the van, shaking his head. "I was driving up here anyway to see my girlfriend. I thought she lived in Kyoto." Izuku frowned. "Is this one a new one?" "It's the same one." Mishio threw his backpack onto his back. "She just moves around a lot for her job." "Ah," Izuku rubbed his chin. "Is she pretty?" Mishio grinned shyly, devastatingly. "When do I get to meet her?" Izuku asked. Mishio shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe someday." He patted the top of Izuku's head. "Now, boys, don't do anything I wouldn't do." "What wouldn't you do?" Izuku narrowed his eyes. Mishio smacked the top of his head playfully. "Don't get too badly hurt." He smiled fondly, before continuing, "I'll be around to pick you up at 7. You have lunch?" "Yeah." Izuku patted his pocket. "Good. Well, see ya." Mishio gave a wave and set off down the path. Seagulls spun and dived in the air, squawking wildly. Every breath dragged salty air into Shouto's lungs. It felt like the sea air was cleaning him out, breaking down the grot and grime that had built up in him from his daily city life. There was a little road in front of him, lined by a few dashes of yellow grass, and finally the ocean stretching out to the horizon, choppy and dark. "Where are we going?" Shouto asked. "My dad has a safe house here," Izuku explained, rubbing his neck. It had been a week since he had last seen his father, but his throat was still sore, though his cheek had nearly completely healed. Shouto froze. "We aren't going to run into him, are we?" "No, don't worry." Izuku led him down the steep hilly path. "My dad's actually in Seoul right now." "That's good," Shouto breathed, following him close. "Besides, I kinda doubt I'll be seeing him much at all from now on." Izuku grinned a little wickedly. "We didn't really part on good terms." "Does he have safe houses all over?" Shouto asked. "Yeah." Izuku stepped off the path and continued carefully down the steep grassy hill. "He uses them for supplies, extra sets of his costumes, stuff like that. He doesn't really trust the local hero joints to have the stuff he needs. And to be honest, he's not wrong. They tend to be understaffed and underfunded." Shouto hummed in agreement. The warehouse was perched precariously on the edge of the cement bank, nearly falling into the sea. It was a huge, dark building with a faded sign on the side that had been made illegible by years of sea spray. The entire building smelt strongly of salt, and it took a moment of struggling for them to open the rusted door. Izuku pressed the light switch. Orange light came in chunks, lighting up huge rectangles of the floor. The inside was huge and bare. The ceiling rose impossibly high above their heads, and the floor space was massive enough that 2 small houses could have probably fit inside it. Shouto walked across the cold concrete floor, listening keenly to the faint echo of his footsteps. "It was used for making boats and back in the day," Izuku said, dropping his bag by the door. "Fishing boats, mostly, although this area isn't all that good for fishing anymore, which is why my dad got it for basically nothing." "It's huge," Shouto marveled. "Yeah, that's the idea," Izuku said, smiling. "I thought this would be a good place for you to use your quirk." Shouto stared at him, dumbfounded. "Use my quirk?" "With a quirk like yours, there's no point in trying to separate it from your fighting style," Izuku explained. "I think it's good to have a basic understanding of martial arts in case a villain with Eraserhead's quirk or something similar appears. But for most villains it'd actually be counterproductive to bring them close enough for a fist fight, especially if you can avoid it." "That's true," Shouto said. "What you really need is accuracy." Izuku said, "I've asked the people who saw you use your quirk in the entrance exam. You basically froze an entire building to get one of the robots, right? And totally melted another one." "Yeah," Shouto said, shyly. "I'm not that subtle." "It's a good thing," Izuku grinned at him. "Most heroes have to work to make their quirk stronger, but with you we're going to have to work backwards in a sense." Shouto nodded. Izuku pulled a few ping-pong paddles from his back, along with a few poles. He spent a few minutes tapping the paddles to the tops of the poles, and then walked over to the center of warehouse. There were a few holes in the cement where pulleys used to go, and the poles slotted into them perfectly. Izuku admired his handiwork. Okay, he said, I want you to hit one of the paddles without hitting any others. Ice or fire? Shouto asked. Either. Breathing deeply, Shouto scented himself. He spread his arms and loosened his shoulders. Then, swinging his left arm in an arc, he shot flames across the warehouse. All 5 paddles caught fire. Put them out. Izuku yelped. Shouto set a quick jet of ice that coated the paddles as well as a square meter around them. The paddles and their poles were suspended in ice like a woolly mammoth. Sorry, Shouto said, sheepishly. Don't worry, Izuku sighed. I brought spares. The task turned out to be fiendishly difficult. Shouto hadn't realized it, but the sheer strength that coursed through his veins was nearly impossible to control. Every time he called on it, power burst from him like a broken pipe, limited only by how long he allowed it to stay. In the moment he summoned it, ice coated every inch around him, and fire roared like the flames of hell. Izuku suggested keeping his focus solely on a single paddle and acting as if the others didn't exist. He even painted one a different color. It didn't work. Even though Shouto only meant to hit one, the others were caught up as collateral. This is ridiculous, Shouto complained through gritted teeth. How am I going to be any use as a hero if I can't even hit one paddle? Izuku chipped away at the ice, digging out the paddles. But you can hit one, he grinned. It's not hitting the others that's the problem. I can't control it. Shouto grumbled. You're just not used to trying. Izuku said. I'm sure if you put your mind to it, you could do it. Shouto grimaced. He bit back a retort about how, since Izuku didn't have a quirk, he really had no idea what he was talking about. He clenched his fist. Doing something over and over again and expecting a different result is the definition of madness, Izuku said, according to Einstein at least. He wiggled the handle of a frozen paddle, trying to dislodge it from the ice. Shouto frowned. Should we move the paddles further apart? That wouldn't solve anything. Izuku shifted his grip on the paddle's handle. Sometimes when I'm having trouble learning something, it's because I've been thinking about it too hard. It's like how tennis players envision where they want to hit the ball to, rather than how to hit it. The body is hindered by the mind overthinking things. So I should focus on, Shouto frowned, on hitting the paddle rather than avoiding the others. I'm already doing that. The handle snapped free from the ice, leaving the top half behind. Izuku raised it in the air and pointed to it. Hit this, Izuku shouted. Shouto stared in shock. You'll get hit too, Shouto shouted back. No, I won't. Izuku beamed at him. You won't hit me. Shoot a fireball at the center of this paddle. I'll be fine. The absolute trust in Izuku's eyes was almost enchanting. Shouto shook his head quickly. How do you know I won't hit you? You won't, Izuku said, voice hard with certainty. Shouto believed him. Shoulders back, arms long, he clenched his hand into a fist. His heart beat wildly. Excitement and nervousness battled for control of his heart. He swung his arm and shot a fist-sized fireball at the paddle. It hit dead on, flames rolling. Izuku shouted and dropped the paddle, clutching his hand. Shouto sprinted over, kicking the burning paddle over. Did I hit you? He asked, frantic. I'm sorry. No. Izuku batted his arm, laughing. It was the steam, since the paddle was still frozen. It scalded my wrist. Oh, Shouto's eyes widened. So I didn't hit you? No. Izuku rubbed his pink hand, embarrassed. I should have really thought that through, but at least it worked. Shouto grinned at him. They tried a few more times after running Izuku's scalded hand under cold water and wrapping it in a towel. Every time Izuku held the paddle, Shouto hit it dead on. Izuku tried drawing his face in Sharpie on the other paddles and an angry face on the one Shouto was going to hit, and it worked. His accuracy had jumped to 100%. Around noon, Shouto was starting to get hungry, and Izuku picked up his bag. He looked back at the warehouse floor, at the patches of ice and scorch marks that covered the empty cement. We're going to have to clean that up later, Izuku sighed. Yeah, Shouto agreed, following him outside. They chose a nice spot of grass on the steep hill and took lunches from the bag. For a moment, they ate in silence. The sea rolled and boiled below them, white foam stark against the black water. It wasn't hard to image something under the dark depths. Something evil and dangerous that was waiting for the right moment to crawl out. It was impossible to see far under the surface. How did you know how to get my quirk to work in small doses? Shouto asked. Izuku ran a spoon around the bottom of his yogurt pot. My sister, he explained. She couldn't use her quirk except to ice an entire field when she played football and got hurt, or when she tripped and iced a filled car park. The only time she used it correctly was when Mishio fell off the top of a ship when we were taking a ferry ride. She made a perfect iceberg to land on, complete with snow cushioning and everything, since she knew he couldn't swim. She made it. Izuku snapped his fingers, on instinct alone. Shouto popped a piece of cooked hot dog into his mouth, chewing it thoughtfully. So Mishio can use fire and Fayumi can use ice. He mulled. That's some odd heritage, I suppose, Izuku said, stiffly. Shouto frowned and changed the subject. Can we come back here next week? It's going to take a lot of work to get my quirk up to scratch. Izuku raised an eyebrow. Only if you want to. Shouto amended quickly. I know you're already teaching the class after school. I shouldn't really be asking for more. It's pretty rude of me. Sorry. It's fine, Izuku laughed. I appreciate the enthusiasm. I enjoy training you guys. I like examining new quirks. It's always interesting. Shouto smiled at him and dug into his sticky rice. When they finished eating, they lay back against the grass. The sea rolled below them restlessly, like it was trying to speak to them in a language they didn't understand. Gulls pecked savagely at a box of chips near the main road, squawking madly. There was an almost unreality to the sea when you were quiet, a sense that nothing would ever change. Just ask it, Izuku mumbled. What? You've been wanting to ask me something all morning, Izuku said. Shouto frowned. He pulled up grass, trying to find words. Finally, he asked, what's it like, not having a quirk? Izuku hummed. He stretched his arms up, folding them comfortably behind his head. What about this question? If you were quirkless, would you still want to be a hero? Shouto's eyebrows knitted together. Probably not was his first thought, but he didn't want that to be his answer. He struggled with himself for a moment. Maybe, he said, finally. Izuku stared up at the clear, cold sky. Blue reflected in his dark eyes. It's like that for me, he said, breathing out deeply, except there is no what if. I've had an idea, Izuku said, when they returned to the warehouse. Oh yeah. Shouto zipped up Izuku's bag and dropped it by the door. What if instead of a stream of ice, Izuku swung his arm out, you just had a brick? A brick. Shouto frowned. Yeah, Izuku said, a projectile. You can shoot it, like gun. He made finger guns at Shouto, shooting them and then blowing over the tip. Shouto rubbed his chin. I suppose it's possible. Izuku pulled the paddles from out of his bag, grinning. Shouto felt himself grin right back, a comfortable warmth settling within him simply from seeing Izuku excited. Mishio opened the warehouse door. Duck, Izuku shouted. Mishio leaped out of the way just in time for a block of thin ice to shatter where his head had been. He looked at the heavy chunks of ice warily. Sorry, Shouto shouted. I didn't think anyone was going to come in. My fault. Mishio didn't take his eyes off the broken ice. Should have knocked. Did you get to see your girlfriend again? Izuku asked. How is she? Yeah, Mishio sighed. She's good. Izuku pushed the paddles into his bag, nodding. He zipped up the bag and threw it over his shoulder. Could you help clear the ice up? He asked. Mishio blinked. Oh, of course. He pressed his hand to the chunks of leftover ice. Won't he notice all the extra water around? Izuku shrugged. This place is always damp anyway. Unless he tests it, he won't know it isn't seawater that's gotten in. Mishio nodded, picking up a brick of ice and melting it between his hands. Thank you for the lift. Shouto opened the door and smiled at Mishio, who nodded at him. Then he beamed at Izuku. Thanks for the training, it was really useful. Izuku grinned at him and lifted the seatbelt up so he could slam the door. Shouto waved from the steps to his apartment building, watching them pull away. Houses rolled by. Izuku pressed his face against the window, watching dully as they passed windows and garden parties, little fleeting glimpses into other people's lives. He sighed. Mishio, he started, and swallowed thickly. What does it mean when you really want to hang out with someone? When all you want to do is be with them, just hanging out, not even doing anything. Does this person make you very happy? Mishio asked, mildly. Are you just thinking of them and sighing? Yeah, Izuku frowned. Mishio turned and grinned at him. Here in Lovi, they passed less and less foliage as the city around them grew more urban. The streets swapped trees for streetlights and rubbish bins. Izuku frowned deeper. But I think we're related. Mishio slammed on the brakes. Izuku's head hit the front seat with a thunk, and it took a moment to regain his balance. What was that for? He snapped. Mishio turned and stared at him, face bloodless. He stared at him for a long moment. Related how? He asked, finally. Not like that. Izuku rubbed his forehead. You know how mom swapped me as a kid with someone else? I think they're the genetic Todoroki. Like, their mom was supposed to be mine. Mishio visibly relaxed, holding his head in his hands. He laughed, breathlessly. Jesus Christ, Izuku. He laughed. God, don't scare me like that. Jesus Christ, you crazy bastard. I thought you meant you liked Dorado like that for a moment. God, no. Izuku balked. No, never. Mishio took a moment to calm himself down and turned back to the steering wheel, pulling the car out. You aren't related to the genetically Todoroki kid, he said, finally. I'm not. Izuku frowned. No, you aren't genetically related, and you weren't socialized as siblings, Mishio sighed. It's a little weird, to be honest, but it's not like incestuous. Izuku smiled awkwardly. Oh, okay. Good. Just think before you speak, please, Mishio said, tiredly. Izuku squirmed. Sorry. It doesn't matter now. Mishio said, you almost gave me a damn heart attack, though. They drove in silence. Izuku recognized the city around them. He spotted the dead-looking apartment building on the corner of the street from his first outing as Flowers. He thought he saw Minami jogging down the street opposite him. Trees he'd bent in fights hung awkwardly, but no worse for wear. Izuku leant his forehead against the window. A chill spread through his hair. Look, Izuku, Mishio started, and ended in a sigh. I've kinda got a confession to make. Yeah, Izuku said, perking up. Mishio gripped the steering wheel tightly. He shifted his grip, shaking his head slightly. The girlfriend. My current girlfriend. The one I told you about. Mishio swallowed. It's not a girl this time. He's a guy. Izuku blinked. Look, I know it's sudden. Mishio gritted his teeth. And yeah, I've had girlfriends. I mean, I really like girls, but I met this guy at work and he's really. Mishio's shoulders tensed up, but he forced them down. It's not. Mishio, Izuku interrupted. Mishio fell silent. He kept his eyes fixed on the road. It's cool, Izuku said. Mishio glanced back at him, eyebrows raised. It's cool, he repeated, tentatively. Yeah, Izuku frowned. Why wouldn't it be? Mishio gritted his teeth, weaving through traffic. Dad found out, he said, finally. Oh, yeah. Mishio rubbed a burn that stretched over his whole right forearm. Thank God you taught me some judo, right? Izuku looked at the back of his head sadly. He said nothing. Something unhappy and cold rolled in his stomach. You can meet him, Mishio said, suddenly. I'll bring him home tomorrow, while Dad's still in Seoul. Arata will be back then too. We can be like a real family until Enji's in the country again. That'd be nice, Izuku said, smiling. And hey, the swamp Todoroki kid I fancy, he's a guy. Yeah, it's Shouto. It's pretty obvious. Mishio gritted his teeth and groaned. Oh, man, what? Izuku blinked. It's not. It's just that Dad's going to want some heirs, he said. I think Fayumi's trying to woo Hamada and Arata's. Well, who would marry that guy? If both you and I don't get girlfriends, then he's going to flip his fucking lid. Hey, Izuku leaned forward and gripped Mishio's shoulder. Fuck Enji Todoroki. Mishio stared at him in the dashboard mirror. A grin cracked across his face, and then he was laughing, tears in his eyes. God, you're right. He choked out, when he had stopped laughing too hard to talk. I've been so tied up in what Dad wants. But, fuck, I'm an adult now. Fuck him. Izuku grinned, settling back in his seat. I don't know why you keep coming back here. Tsurumi, the dojo master, said. I don't have anything to teach you. The dojo was warm in the afternoon sun. It was bare, mats drawn up to the sides. A smooth wood floor seemed to stick to Izuku's bare feet. The rest of the students had already filed out, with a few stragglers taking a while to pull their shoes on. I need to keep repeating the basics, Izuku explained. It's the basis of everything I'm doing. Still, Tsurumi folded her arms across her chest. I had an idea of how to spice up your training sessions. Izuku looked at her warily. Tsurumi may have been his youngest dojo master, but she had a wicked streak a mile wide. What is it? Tsurumi pulled a blindfold from her pocket. I want you to defend yourself from me, she said, blind. Okay, so, Izuku addressed his crowd of classmates, who were sitting patiently on the wet grass. We're going to be moving on to real sparring soon. A few students cheered, and Kirishima howled like a wolf. So I thought I'd show you what a real spar looks like, Izuku finished. Behind the crowd, a car door slammed shut. A tall man with a muscular build walked around the crowd. His hair was a sheer white, with an underside of red, like a polar bear with an open wound. He stood next to Izuku, grinning. This is Mishio, Izuku said. He's my brother. It's nice to meet you all, Mishio waved. Mina glanced between Izuku and Mishio. Looks wise. They had barely anything in common. We're gonna spar. Izuku took a few steps back. Kirishima, could you call it? Kirishima nodded and stood up. Go easy on me, Mishio whispered. You know I won't. Izuku grinned. Go, Kirishima bellowed. Izuku was on him in the blink of an eye. He moved impossibly fast. Much faster than he did teaching, crashing blow after blow on his brother. Mishio was backing away quickly, trying desperately to block every one of the dozens of blows that came raining down on him. It only took one time. Mishio was too slow to raise his arm to block his head, and Izuku caught his skull in a crushing blow that knocked him clean off his feet. Mishio hit the earth hard, groaning, arms wrapping around his head. Izuku stood over his fallen brother, panting hard. Man, Izuku's kinda scary, huh? Uraraka whispered. Silently, Ida agreed. Shouto began to clap. Izuku met Shouto's eyes and grinned at him. He turned to address the rest of the class. It goes, he shook a hand, something like that. The car park was empty and bare, the summer sun heating the tarmac to smoking hot under their feet. The sky was a refreshing blue that brightened the class's mood as they waited. One made an odd bunch, all in their hero outfits and clustered around the coach, chatting absently. Izuku stepped out of the school, kicking into a half-jog to catch up with the class. Sorry I took so long, he said. I forgot to pick up my costume. Mina groaned. It looks so dull, she complained. Yuga flipped his hair and sighed dramatically. She's got a point, Izuku. Shouto frowned. Izuku flushed, looking down at his costume. It was a simple black Kevlar bodysuit that looked a little like a wetsuit, with large steel-capped boots and a mask he could pull over his head. The only color on his suit was a ring of compact pockets around his middle that were a dark gray. I didn't want to stand out too much, he protested. You won't stand out at all, Asui said. What's the point of having a costume at this point? Izuku scratched the back of his neck, reluctant to admit that he would much prefer to be fighting in whatever clothes he happened to be wearing. It seemed like too much of a hassle to change clothes, especially if everyone knew his secret identity anyway. Is everyone here? Aizawa leaned out of the coach. He squinted around the crowd. Then what you all hanging about for? We'll be late if we don't leave soon. The coach journey was relaxing. Izuku got on well with the rest of the class, more so than he had any other of his classes. There was something in them all that joined them, a common love of heroics and exercise that was endearing. The city that rolled past their window slowly became the country. The gaps between houses grew, and green started to interrupt gray and brown. The rumble of the coach was slowly lulling him to sleep, and Izuku only noticed he was drifting off when he fell forward in his seat. Shouto caught the tag on the back of his neck, holding him up. Are you all right? Izuku rubbed his eyes. I'm fine. Did you get enough sleep last night? Shouto asked. It's not that. Moving vehicles always makes me sleepy. He yawned. You're such a mother hen, Shouto. Uraraka teased. I'm not. Shouto scowled. We're here, Aizawa said flatly, opening the coach door. The class filed out onto the beaten earth. The arena was huge and domed like a cathedral. White walls stretched high above their heads. They were led inside, and then they gasped. It was enormous, and structured like a zoo or an expensive resort. Maybe half a dozen different environments were scattered around the inside, some as large as a couple miles long. Each contained a different environment: water, fire, a mini mountain range, a long line of buildings. It was truly astonishing to look at, a microcosm of every place in which a hero might fight. Izuku leaned over the railings, staring at the environments. The level of detail that went into them was unbelievable. He spotted full rubbish bins in the streets of the city, little moss growing over the mountainous area, the flicker of fish in the water areas. It was beyond anything he had expected. It's incredible, he said, grinning. Thank you. A hero dressed in a modified astronaut suit waved at him. I created this arena to simulate all kinds of disasters a hero might encounter. It is the ultimate space for jams. Number 13. Uraraka bounced on the spot. I've always thought you were really cool. Hey, 13, Aizawa glanced around. Shouldn't All Might be here by now? It looks as though he's run out of time today. 13 held up 3 fingers covertly. He's in the nap room right now. Aizawa sighed, resigned. We'll just have to start without him. 13 nodded and stepped back to address the whole crowd. Before we begin, just one thing. Or two. Izuku stepped back into the crowd of his classmates, fixing the pro hero with his full attention. Uraraka was nearly vibrating with excitement. I'm sure you're all aware, but my quirk is called Black Hole, 13 said, lifting his white-capped fingers. It doesn't matter what I capture with my quirk, it will all turn to dust. He curled his stubby fingers into a fist. It is, however, a quirk that could also easily be used to kill people. And in a way, it's still exactly the same as the quirks you all have. He lifted his head, looking at Izuku. You'll just have to use your imagination for this bit, I'm afraid. Izuku laughed nervously. An odd sound drew his attention, and he turned towards it. It was a metallic scratching, coming from somewhere behind him, but he couldn't place it. In today's society, quirks are heavily regulated, he continued. You've already tested your limits with Aizawa's test, and tasted battle with All Might's trial. Please don't forget your quirks can cause serious harm if misused. His bright white almond eyes widened. That being said, this lesson will be a fresh start. Your quirks do not exist to harm but to help. Let's all get to studying how to wield our quirks for the sake of saving human lives. The scratching grew louder. It sounded distorted, like Izuku was hearing it through gauze. He approached the railings and stared down, trying to see what was causing it. That is all. You all listened so well, and you have my thanks. 13 bowed deeply. That was awesome, Uraraka said, pumping her arms. Ada clapped wildly. A black dot appeared on the floor below. Izuku peered at it, shifting his head, trying to place it. No, it wasn't on the floor, but instead, it hung in midair, dripping black dust. What the? Izuku leaned over the railings, trying to figure out what it could. Swelling, the black dot became a spinning vortex, dust scattering across the clean floor. The scratching grew to a tearing, like metal was being ripped apart. The sound drew Aizawa's attention too, and he turned to it. Out of the black vortex came a hand, thin, ghoulish, and a face, even worse. Hands gripped the face from all angles. A red-rimmed wide eye peered through the fingers. Gray, lanky hair framed the ugly face. The vortex burst open like a maggot-filled boil, spilling villains onto the arena floor. Huddle together and don't move. Aizawa bellowed. Number 13. Protect the students. What is that? Kirishima tried to peer past Aizawa. Those are villains. Aizawa shouted. This is unfair, the ugly guy said, dropping to the earth. The disembodied hand that clutched his face obscured most it, but he sounded upset. I thought All Might was supposed to be here. Do you think he'll show up? He scratched the soft skin under his neck. If we start killing the children, 13. Try contact to the school. Aizawa pushed his glasses up his nose. You too, Kaminari? Kaminari startled and nodded. Aizawa leapt off the platform, cloth ropes latching onto the roof. His hair whipped out behind him, burying his feet into the face of the first villain his trajectory carried him into. He spun, bringing another kick into the neck of another. God, pro heroes are such a pain, the ugly guy said, scratching the skin where his jaw joined his neck. If we were just any rabble, we wouldn't stand a chance. We've got to evacuate, Ada shouted. Suddenly, a dark shadow fell over them. Black stretched out ahead of them, coating the air with smoke. Two liquid white eyes pierced the darkness, focusing on them. Whoever it was, Izuku doubted much of them was human anymore. I can't allow you to go, the darkness said. We are the Villain Alliance. I apologize for the intrusion, but we are here to kill All Might. Kill. Izuku stumbled back, heart thundering. Was Mr. All Might not due to attend? White eyes shifted in the mass of black. Is he a man to leave children to suffer? In tandem, both Kirishima and Bakugo leapt at the darkness. It retracted suddenly, drawing the smoke in to avoid them. An explosion just missed the metal casing of the darkness torso. That was a close thing, the darkness' steady voice said. I expect there is a reason you children are referred to as golden eggs. Don't engage. 13 shouted. Just run, you two. Black burst over them, trapping them in a tide of smoke. There is no point in running. A voice boomed from the smoke. You will be scattered and killed. Darkness coated everyone, thick, choking, and complete. The dark receded. For one long second, Izuku hung, suspended in the air. He stared down at the water below him, still and reflective as a pane of glass. No thoughts crossed his mind. Then he fell, and screamed. Hitting the water was like hitting cement. Air escaped his lungs in a burst of bubbles, and his side burned. It took him a few seconds to orientate himself, head swimming. A shark villain, with a huge, gaping mouth, swam towards him. Izuku shouted in surprise. Another mistake. The rest of his air escaped. He flailed around wildly. Suddenly, a tongue wrapped around his middle and threw him into the air, out of the water. He hit solid ground and managed to roll enough to avoid injury. After a few embarrassing moments of vomiting up water, he stood up. Asui threw Minta onto the boat and climbed up herself. The way she moved was strange, keeping her toes and hands flat against the side of the boat. Thank you, Asui, Izuku said, wiping his mouth. Call me Tsuyu. She peered over the edge of the boat. We're in a real pickle now. Izuku rubbed his chin. It's crazy. They knew we were going to be here, and they knew All Might was coming too. But they can't kill All Might. Minta squawked. As soon as he comes, bam. That'll be the end of these villains. He punched the air. This is a huge organization. Izuku stared out at the bombing villains. They wouldn't have risked coming here unless they had at least a chance of killing him. Maybe, Tsuyu said, but we've got to deal with these guys first. She nodded her head towards the villains. If All Might really is in danger, the least we can do is make sure he doesn't have to worry about us. Izuku nodded in agreement and started to pace. He began to mutter under his breath. You know, those guys aren't coming up here, Minta said. That's right, Tsuyu frowned. And it's odd that they sent me to a water zone. Surely if they knew what they were doing, they would send me to a fire zone. I'd be totally useless there. They must not know about our quirks, Izuku said, and then froze. I mean, you guys' quirks. Tsuyu patted his arm sympathetically. That's no help though, Minta sighed, pulling balls from his head. Even if they don't know our quirks, only Tsuyu-chan is useful at a time like this. Hey, Izuku frowned. Don't you start. Minta pulled more balls from his head. They collected in little pyramids on the deck around him. You're even more useless than I am in this situation. Hey, Izuku shouted. Don't be rude. Minta, Tsuyu's eyebrows knitted together. You're in no position to call anyone useless. Look, let's not argue, Izuku said. I have a plan. Tsuyu, how fast can you swim? Tsuyu looked up at him. Here. Izuku passed Minta a bag of remote explosives. You know what to do. I would much rather be tied to Tsuyu's lap, Minta grumbled. They were all tied together, with Tsuyu facing forward and Izuku tied to her back to back, with Minta in his lap. The cable tie around his middle was incredibly uncomfortable, but it was needed to allow Tsuyu's hands to be free. Morally, I couldn't do that and call myself a hero, Izuku frowned. Whatever, Minta said, pulling an explosive out. They were around the size of a lighter and were a light gray. Now, you're sure these won't go off in my hand? Not if you keep them in the bag, Izuku said, pushing Minta's hand back in. Minta started to sweat. Please pay attention, Todoroki, he begged. I take back what I said earlier about you being useless. Izuku rolled his eyes. If I set them off while you were holding them, I'd get hurt too, moron. Are two ready? Tsuyu asked, lifting both of them up. Despite her size and shape, she was surprisingly strong. Yeah, Izuku said, giving her a nod she couldn't see. Minta scrambled. Actually, Tsuyu dived. Water burst up on all sides. The moment they hit the water, the villains lunged for them like sharks tasting blood. They crowded around them, slashing and biting. The first mistake, the lack of visibility. Minda was not dexterous enough to pull a bubble from his head, stick a bomb to it and throw it before a villain simply knocked it out of his hand. Minda squealed as a shark came barreling towards them. Izuku pressed Minda's head to his chest so he was out of range and slammed a fist into the shark's jaw. It spun away, bleeding. Minda whimpered. Second mistake. With both of them tied to her back, Tsuyu was much slower. She worked hard, trying to drag them through the water and avoid villains. But the added weight ruined her natural buoyancy, and without it every moment she wasn't moving she started sinking. The third mistake. Izuku couldn't defend himself well with limited movement and a narrow line of sight. It was all he could do to deflect blades and punches. If he didn't have the Kevlar gloves, he would have lost a finger by now. Just drop them, Izuku shouted when his head bobbed above the water. What? Minda squirmed. The bag. Izuku panted, kicking a swordfish man in the nose, snapping it with a satisfying crack. Empty it. Minda tipped the bag up. They dropped like a small cloud of silver fish. The villains parted for it. Izuku set them off. An explosion ripped through the lake. Water boiled under them, bubbling madly, throwing them cleanly into the air. They hit the bank with a crack, Tsuyu taking most of the fall. Izuku turned them and pulled them out, scrambling onto the earth. He undid the tie with a snap. Tsuyu fell back, stumbling. She rubbed her side. Hey, Minda swung from Izuku's front. His hair had stuck to the top of Izuku's chest and he was still dangling. What? Izuku pressed down on Minda's shoulders, and he detached with a pop, leaving 2 sticky balls sticking to his chest. Minda laughed. They look like boobs. Can you take them off? Izuku asked, reluctant to touch them. Minda frowned. I can try. Minda grabbed the balls and with surprisingly little effort they popped off. Whoa, he stared at them. What's that made of? I don't know, Izuku said, spreading a hand over his chest. It's supposed to be near frictionless. Tsuyu prodded her arm experimentally. She winced. Are you okay? Izuku asked. You took most of the fall. It must have hurt. I'm probably just bruised, Tsuyu said. Izuku scratched the back of his neck. I'm sorry, the plan was really bad, he said. I didn't think it through properly. Not all plans work perfectly, Tsuyu said. I know, but if you'd had, like, Shouto or Bakugo instead of me, you'd have had a much easier time of it. Izuku rubbed the back of his neck. Tsuyu rested a hand on his shoulder. We're all still alive. She pointed to the unconscious villains floating in the water. You dealt with a lot of villains at once. As far as I'm concerned, that's a win. Izuku smiled. Thanks. We should move, Minda said warily. Some of them are starting to wake up. The 3 of them started to run. The earth under their feet was hard and compact, but natural feeling. Izuku took a moment to appreciate 13's attention to detail. A crash brought their attention forward. Aizawa jumped into view, hair fanning out behind him. 2 villains dived for him and he ducked, cloth bindings seemingly moving on their own to tie and dispatch them. Eraserhead drove an elbow into the ugly guy's stomach. You're weakening, Eraserhead, the ugly guy said, eyes wide in the gaps between pale fingers. His hand caught Aizawa's elbow. Under his fingers, the skin began to crack like porcelain, blood rolling through the cracks. Aizawa recoiled, snatching his elbow away and cracking a fist across the villain's jaw. We have to help him, Izuku hissed. Tsuyu grabbed his elbow. We can't. The least we can do is stay out of the way and avoid being hostages. A huge black monster snatched Aizawa's arm and snapped it cleanly. The monster pressed a heavy hand into the back of Aizawa's head, forcing it into the earth. Tell the symbol of peace, the ugly guy was saying. Voice raw, he's wanted by Namu. Aizawa shifted in the dirt, trying to lift his head. His hair fell around his eyes, thick and heavy. Blood pooled around Aizawa's arms, sticking his hair together. We've got no choice, Izuku hissed, zipping up his suit. He's going to die. Izuku, Tsuyu started, but the boy was already running. Izuku leapt at Ugly, who dodged easily, slipping out of reach. His lifeless, greasy hair stuck to the back of his neck. Oh, Ugly asked, voice lilting. Can't stand to see your teacher hurt. You must have a death wish, brat. Izuku, Aizawa gritted his teeth. Let go of him, Izuku scowled. He dropped into a fighting stance, legs shoulder-width apart. Water rolled off his sleek black suit. Ugly stared straight at Izuku. For a moment he was still. I know you, he said, and his voice grew scratchy and strange. I know you. You're that quirkless scumbag, aren't you? He laughed, a horrible, crazed sound. You're going to fight me. You've got guts, you piece of shit. Too bad we'll be spilling them before long. Izuku scowled. A quirkless child under All Might's tutelage. Ugly bent over, fingers spreading in the air. You're as close to an innocent as we're gonna get. Ugly dived for him, and Izuku darted away. Izuku pulled a knife from his belt, running backwards. Get the girl, Ugly shouted. What the fuck are you standing around for? Ugly glanced back at the gathered villains standing on the bank. A red-haired woman dived for Tsuyu. Air solidified into prongs around her hand and she swung at the frog-like girl. Suddenly the air dissipated, and Tsuyu deflected the woman's arm easily. Izuku tripped, falling back against the stairs. Thanks for taking the bait, sensei, Ugly said. His hand closed around Izuku's face. Izuku screamed. His hand closed around Izuku's face. Izuku screamed. In an instant, his skin started to dissolve. It was the most pain he had ever felt, like hot oil through his veins. White popped dizzily in front of his eyes. He ripped his face away, splattering blood across the earth, shoving himself off the stairs before scrambling to his feet. Blood ran down his face, pooling in his collarbone. It felt like his skin had been ripped off, horribly hot and sharp. His eyes were filled with the blood that ran from his forehead. And for all that he rubbed at them, he couldn't clear them. He was blind. You can roll over and die if you want, Ugly said somewhere near his left. Blood loss from those wounds will take a few hours to kill you, though. Maybe I should help you with that. Izuku didn't have much experience fighting blind, but he did know a few things. First, relax. Use your other senses. He struggled to regulate his breathing. Knife stretched out in front of him. His other hand found the third pocket from his side and pulled out a special detonator and pressed his thumb on the button. You're going to try to fight me quirkless, blind and with one fucking hand. Ugly roared. You're really insulting me now, asshole. I'm not letting you die quickly anymore. Second, keep track of your opponent's position in your mind. Izuku managed to locate the source of Ugly's voice. 3 o'clock. He didn't move towards it, but he kept his mind on it as Ugly sprinted towards him. Die, Ugly shouted, and Izuku jerked towards him, slashing wildly. Ugly jumped back, growling like a rabid dog. Third, predict their movements. Izuku jumped back as Ugly dived for his hand. He landed awkwardly, but managed not to lose balance. He kept the detonator close to his chest, stabbing the air when he heard Ugly come for him. He could tell Ugly was getting agitated. Izuku hit something, knocking him off balance. His leg buckled and he dropped his knife. Panic overtook his mind and he scrambled around for the knife, hitting the earth blindly. A kick knocked stars into his eyes. Izuku coughed, head jerking around wildly. Another kick smashed into the underside of his jaw. You're nothing. Nothing. Ugly slammed his foot into Izuku's ear. You're scum. You're quirkless garbage. Izuku curled into a ball, gripping his head tightly. He sobbed. The front door burst open, smashing into the walls beside it. Ugly took his foot from Izuku's head. Izuku's head lifted from the earth and he moved his head around, even though he was still blind. Confusion buzzed in his mind, and he felt like was going to faint. Have no fear. A wonderfully familiar voice shook the air, for I am here. Izuku's head dropped against the earth. He started crying, relief flooding through him. A gust of wind, and the sound of impossibly fast footfalls. Ugly snatched the back of Izuku's hair, lifting him from the ground. He pulled a knife from Izuku's belt and pressed it to Izuku's throat. Stop, Ugly shouted. Move another muscle and I'll slit this scumbag's throat. Izuku heard All Might stop. His concentration was wavering, and he felt himself slipping into unconsciousness, but a deep fire in him was lit. He refused to be a hostage. No, Izuku said, firmly, you won't. Ugly gripped his hair tightly. Izuku felt some of his hair fall out and stick to the back of his bloody hair. What the fuck do you mean, no? When Izuku swallowed, his Adam's apple grazing the blade, he raised the detonator. This is linked a network of explosives under the arena that Endeavor installed, he said. It's a dead man's switch. You kill me and all of us, heroes and villains, will die. I'll blow us all to hell. Ugly shook him by his hair. You're lying. There's no way a runt like you would get something like that. Izuku grimaced. My dad's the number 2 hero. He won't allow me to lose. Would he let his son die in the process? Ugly growled. Isn't he a fucking hero? I'm quirkless, Izuku said, quietly. He shifted his grip on the detonator. My boy, All Might said. And there was a depth of sympathy to his voice. Ugly tugged his hair sharply, hissing. Then, suddenly the knife was gone and Ugly dropped his hair. He snatched him up by the back of his suit and threw him away. Izuku landed hard, head snapping back. Blood rolled over the dried wound on his forehead. Izuku felt darkness tug at him and he dropped the detonator. It was fake, anyway. Izuku dreamed of a hospital. A familiar hospital. The billowing curtains, the plastic floors, the wispy white walls. Inko Midoriya sat in a chair on the other side of the room. Izuku stared at her. He touched his face. It was smooth. Blinking in surprise, he pulled up his shirt. Every wound, every scar he had collected through his life had vanished, replaced with smooth, pale skin. It was surreal, like looking at someone else's body. Another version of his life. Izuku dropped his shirt, grimacing. Am I dead? He asked. Inko shook her head slowly. Izuku watched her carefully. His mother seemed so gentle. Her face was kind and round, and her eyes seemed like softer versions of his own. Her hands were delicate and smooth. Her hair was styled into a bun. Her fringe perfect, neat, green. She smiled at him. Inko stood up. It was a little action, but it surprised Izuku so much he almost woke himself up. He took a step back. She crossed over to him, shoes making no noise across the hospital floor. Slowly, she took his hands in hers. Who are you? She asked, eyes wide and careful. Izuku shifted his feet. Nervous. Let me explain. Izuku woke up. His chest felt empty, but there was a warmth in his stomach. He pulled himself into a sitting position, pressing a hand to his aching skull. Then he remembered Ugly's fingers closing around his face. He felt thick bandages around his forehead and gauze on his temples. Recovery girl did a very good job on you. All Might exclaimed. You should be back to normal in the next few days. Izuku nearly jumped out of bed. All Might was sitting at the end of his bed, smoking. All Might. Hey. Izuku squeaked. I know everyone else has met you before, but this is my first time Sakani Asaimi. Izuku jerked up and realized he had nothing for him to sign. He dived out of bed and snatched an absent form from the nurse's desk. Absent form. Izuku bent his head and held it out to All Might. Well, All Might frowned. Obviously, we are going to allow you any time off that you need to heal. Izuku stood awkwardly for a beat before he caught on. Oh, no, I meant, can I have your autograph? All Might's eyes widened, and he nodded, uncapping a pen and writing All Might in all caps across the form. Izuku took it back when he was done and held it reverently, staring at the signature. He puffed out his chest. Thank you. All Might grinned. You should sit back in bed, he boomed in his deep voice. It is too early to be running around. Izuku obediently perched back on the bed, pulling the covers over his legs. And you should not be thanking me. All Might bowed his head. I have failed you. Izuku blinked. You couldn't have known about the villains, he said, feeling a little awkward. Not about that. All Might gritted his teeth. I knew Enji Todoroki was hurting you. I learned that you were greatly hurt by him, both when you were first taken from the school and when you re-enrolled. Your friend Shouto Midoriya also confessed his fears. In all honesty, I suspected something was deeply wrong with his parenting simply from his attitude towards children throughout the time I knew him. Izuku felt coldness spread through his guts. What are you saying? All Might clenched his fist. I knew Enji was physically and emotionally abusing you and your siblings, and yet, he tensed his jaw. The fact that I simply stood by brings me great shame. I can only apologize from the bottom of my heart. Hey, it's all right. Izuku flushed, embarrassed. It wasn't that bad. It's never been like. He trailed off, chest tight. You are aware that when he strangled you he could well have killed you, All Might said, solemnly. With his strength, that first punch could have given you brain damage. That's just physical stuff, Izuku said, desperately. It was never. And I'm correct in assuming he has said things that are directly intended to humiliate, belittle or embarrass you. All Might said. Has he threatened you? Izuku's voice died. His chest was caught in a vice, squeezing his lungs. A lump formed in his throat. I will not allow you to sully the Todoroki name by applying in your state. You would achieve nothing. I am only saving you from yourself. You are useless, Izuku, and unsuited to hero work. You are nothing, Izuku. You will never be a hero. You're disgusting. I should have killed you when you were a child. I should have buried you along with my fucking witch wife. Izuku's head bowed. Tears clouded his eyes. It's not, he choked. It's not that bad. All Might stood up and crossed to the side of Izuku's bed. He pulled the boy into his arms. Izuku dropped his head against All Might's chest. Don't arrest him, Izuku cried. Please don't. All Might wrapped his arms around him. As heroes, we must not be above the law, he said, grimly. What he has done is illegal. Izuku sobbed. I don't want anyone to. Decay and no. All Might carted a hand through the boy's hair. His hands were so gentle, for one so strong. I know, he said, and I'm sorry. Endeavor turned. He glared down at the young officer, eyes bright and cold. What is it? He asked, booming voice dripping with contempt. There's a W warrant. The officer waved a piece of paper vaguely. Warrants are your business. Endeavor turned back to his computer, a scowl forming across his features. When would they teach the greenhorns not to poke their noses into hero business? Actually, the officer continued with a frown, it's for you. There's a W warrant out for your arrest, sir. Endeavor stared at him. All Might was talking to you about it. Fayumi passed him a cup of cocoa. Izuku was wrapped up in blankets, looking contented. The thick bandages made his head look smaller. He took a sip of cocoa. He said I should press charges, he said, a little tired. He said we should never allow heroes to get away with things that villains do. Amen. Fayumi smiled, but then she frowned. I feel bad though. I should have been that one to suggest going to court. If I saw anything that happened to you happen to a kid in my class, I would leap on it like nobody's business. I guess all this time I just thought, this is how he runs this house. I was letting him get away with it because he was a hero. He did it to you too, Izuku countered. Mishio said you used to have the worst bruises of all, and that you still have some scars from his training. Fayumi frowned. I suppose I did. Izuku took another big gulp of cocoa. The warmth soaked through to his stomach. You know when he hurt your neck, Fayumi said. I took. The front door exploded inwards with a boom, a wave of thick heat rolling over them. Fear flared into life in Izuku's heart. Fayumi ripped the blankets off him and pulled him to his feet. Back door, she hissed. Now, go. I'll hold him off. Izuku left down the hall, feet pounding. He heard the roar of flames and felt the chill of ice at the back of his neck. He ran out into the street, barefoot and terrified. Night had taken the city completely, and Izuku's feet quickly felt numb and fumbling. He couldn't move his legs fast enough. His knees shook and he forced himself faster, chest seizing. Thundering through the streets, the only sound seemed to be the fearful pounding of his heart and the roar of imagined flames. His feet stubbed against the uneven pavement, but he dragged himself onwards. Pedestrians looked at him, running barefoot in his pajamas like the devil was chasing him, eyes full of concern. One even tried to grab his arm to ask him if he was all right, but he shook them off, choking something unintelligible. Izuku crossed a busy side road without looking, narrowly avoiding a van, sprinting up a paved walkway. His heart almost gave out. Pain in his ribs and head forced him into a stumbling, blind jog. Orange light burst through the other end of the street. Izuku stared at it, eyes filled with tears. God, he was really going to die this time. Izuku, Endeavor bellowed as he shot forward. Propelled by his flaming fists, he landed and skidded, kicking up chunks of tarmac. I'm going to fucking kill you. Looking at his face was like looking into hell. The flames that usually spread from his chin now covered his entire face, boiling and rolling over his skin like hellfire. His skin was dark and twisted, and anger pulling at the fire that was almost inhuman. Forcing himself to push off the wall, he limped down the street, feet fumbling. He needed, desperately, to get away. Endeavor charged. His fist hit ice. Izuku stared. A thick wall of ice separated him and the pro-hero. Endeavor began thumping on the wall, shooting off flames. Thank God I found you, Shouto said. I heard about it on the Hero Network and knew he was going to come after you. Izuku stared at him like he was looking at an angel. Shouto, he breathed, almost reverent. Can you walk? Shouto asked. Izuku looked down at his feet. They were totally dead, coated with blood. I don't. A final blow hit the ice wall and it cracked, steam rolling from the remains. Shouto threw Izuku over his shoulder and started running, dangling over Shouto's back. Izuku had a perfect view of Endeavor. The man was twisted with wrath, fists clenched tightly. Flames erupted from every patch of skin, fanning out behind him, setting trees and litter alight as he ran. Shouto sprinted down the main street. He was panting hard, every step shaking his body roughly. We can't outrun him, Izuku shouted, gripping Shouto's shoulder. We don't need to, Shouto huffed. Izuku frowned. What do you? Suddenly, Endeavor's flames vanished. A white cloud had collected around his head. He hit the tarmac heavily, bouncing. He was out cold. Shouto jogged to a stop. After waiting for a moment to see if Endeavor was getting up, he doubled over and set Izuku down. Midnight ran out of an alleyway, pulling out a pair of large handcuffs. She cuffed Endeavor, maintaining a dense cloud around his mouth and nose. Are you boys all right? She asked. Izuku gave a non-committal gesture. I suppose you wouldn't be okay over something like this. Midnight flipped back her thick mane of black hair. Vines began to coat the building next to them and Kamui wood slid into the road. I came as soon as I could, he said, looking between Endeavor and Izuku. Is everything contained? I've handled it. Midnight raised a hand. Would you call for a helicopter? Kamui nodded and walked away to make a call. Midnight looked at the two teenagers, standing awkwardly in the road. She shook her head sadly. You never think it's going to be one of your own, do you? She said, mainly to herself. Endeavor lay unresponsive at her feet. Izuku, someone screamed. Izuku glanced up. Fayumi was hobbling towards them, jeans torn and bloody. Izuku, are you okay? Your leg. Midnight protested, trying to stop her walking. You need medical attention. Izuku, Fayumi screamed. I'm okay. Izuku shouted back. Oh, thank God. Fayumi sagged onto Midnight's shoulder. God, I really thought that bastard was going to kill him this time. Midnight helped her sit down on the steps outside one of the nearby buildings, making sure to keep an eye on the felled pro-hero. After much hobbling about, Izuku managed to sit next to Fayumi, who hugged him very, very tightly and cried. Shouto sat next to him, keeping a hand on Izuku's leg. More heroes started to arrive, along with a thick crowd of reporters. Many took flashy photos of the three of them sitting on the stairs, or the sleeping Endeavor being lifted into a helicopter. Midoriya and Ko arrived, hugging both Shouto and Izuku very tightly. I saw what happened on the news, she said. I couldn't believe what a horrible thing for a father to do. It makes no sense. Izuku patted her shoulder, finding the whole ordeal a little surreal. Enko sat with them, shooing reporters away and fussing over them. When Enko went to make a phone call, Izuku leaned over to Fayumi. I think I'm going to tell her, he whispered. I think I'm going to tell them both everything. Fayumi tilted her head. You sure he's the, other Todoroki? Izuku looked at her flatly. Shouto frowned, confused, and met Fayumi's eyes with his mismatched pair. You have a point, Fayumi admitted with a grin, but are you sure you want to do it tonight? Izuku shrugged. Tonight seems like a night of truths. Fayumi hummed. Go ahead, then. Thanks, Izuku said. Also, you should really get some medical attention for that foot. Fayumi looked down at her deeply burned foot like she was seeing it for the first time. She blinked at it. Yes, I suppose, she admitted, and tugged on the jacket of the nearest person she saw. Shouto tugged on Izuku's shoulder. What was that about? He asked. What were you talking about? Izuku stood up, wincing as feeling returned to his feet. I'll tell you when we get to your house, he said. I'll tell both of you everything.